The unfortunate girl tried her best to escape from the firm grasp of several people, but the hands were very strong, and all her efforts were in vain. There was a rustle of clothes, and a small blouse was torn, exposing her defenseless body. Someone in the audience had the idea to videotape the whole thing, moreover to start a broadcast. This is all before the chat windows started to appear. The spectators were delighted. At last, they had a new spectacle waiting for them. The unfortunate girl struggled to break free. The strong hands of the teenagers held her. She was completely defenseless. There were more of them, plus she was very weak. The chat icon said that someone had taken some screenshots. One of the teenagers turned around and smiled wryly and asked the poor girl if he was the one she was looking for. There was a wry smile on the guy's face. He took almost physical pleasure in mocking people. One of the torturers holding his hair tightly brought in another guy. The one was completely naked and tried to cover his nakedness with his hands, his eyes pointed downward, full of shame. In a loud voice, he turned to the poor guy and said that their excellent student Jung had called out to him very loudly. That naked guy was a high school volunteer, Wu Ji. The man threw him to the floor, and the poor man, unable to keep from weakness, fell with a clatter to the tiled floor. A thunderous laughter broke out. The others sat on chairs and tables watching the results of their abuse with rapt attention. Everyone was filming what was happening on their phones. It was impossible to miss such a shocking moment. It would be a real sensation. Wu Ji was lying on the floor, naturally gritting his teeth in resentment and pain. There was nothing he could do. There were more of these guys, and they were obviously stronger than him. One of the bastards turned to him. He said that the guy knew exactly what was required of him, didn't he? The poor man reached his hand towards the girl, whose clothes were already completely ripped off. He said through his tears that he didn't want that either. The situation was hopeless. He had no choice anyway. It seemed like he wanted to prove to himself that he wasn't to blame for this. His hand was already close to the girl's breast. His hands were shaking, and it was as if everything inside him had shrunk. In the online chat room there was laughter. Some were delighted with what was happening, and some were already pretty tired of it. The main character who was so mocked was a teacher. On his share fell a lot of bullying from students. At that time they were just incredibly cruel. There was the sound of a slap, and the teacher squinted in pain. He didn't know what would happen to him next. These teenagers were capable of so much. The man was in a completely hopeless situation. All he could do was sit there and endure the inhuman abuse. A boy named Wang Wei looked at him with disgust and asked, did he really think he was going to get something? The girl who was holding the object of abuse asked, isn't this too cruel a start? This man might even die. Wei spit on the floor and said, don't be such a wimp. Even if he really dies, none of the students will be held accountable. The teacher sat on the sidelines and could do nothing. He was completely useless in this situation. He only had to watch helplessly as the crowd of ruthless students bullied the student, and he only had the strength to apologize to her for being useless. His neck, head, and shoulders were completely bloody from the violent blows. The skin burned as if a torch had been held to it. But now, there was nothing the man could do. His body was so weakened that he could barely open his eyes. Wai came close to the student. She didn't even have the strength to cry. In a short voice, the boy began to speak. She begged for help, and who came to her? He was bullying her harder and harder every second, trying to crush her mentally. The freak got close to the girl and stuck out his ugly tongue, trying to lick her latch. The girl was struggling. She screamed, begging for help and mercy, but no one seemed to hear her. Wu Ji suddenly felt a strange sensation. It was as if he was falling somewhere, into some deep hole. The man didn't understand what was wrong. What's going on? A sign popped up in front of him that read, Wu Jia's carrier status is dead. The killing intent system is activating the transference. The man passed out, unable to see the poor student continue to be tortured. The school children were laughing, taking almost physical pleasure from such cruelty. The girl screamed and begged for mercy, but no one heard or listened to me. The girl with her last gasp of air screamed, "Why are they doing this to her?" She screamed in pain and hatred. She didn't understand why she deserved to be treated so horribly. There was silence for a second. Everyone stared at her in amazement. Her glasses continued to hold up her phone and filmed the whole thing. For a second, confusion flashed across the students' faces, but it was only a momentary weakness. Wang Wei smiled even wider and asked the girl in a formidable tone, didn't she enjoy seeking justice for the weaklings? Since that was the case, she would take their place. The girls next to her grabbed her even tighter and started tearing her clothes without letting her break free. The guy said, "Why is she floundering? Don't let her play dumb. That's right. She's such a noble, so she should take their place right." The bastard stepped even closer to her and grabbed her head. He put her hands behind her back so that she had no chance to escape. He came even closer to her and ordered her to be an obedient girl, otherwise who knows what would happen to him. But the girls I had just held her to looked in surprise in the direction where the teacher was. Now, and he himself shifted his astonished eyes there to see what they saw there. The protagonist rose to his feet and covered himself with his cloak so that no one could see his shame. It was as if the man had been transformed in an instant. His face became serious and even partly cruel. All this time, the guys kept filming what was happening and the chat room was filled with wonder. Can he still stand? The man sighed heavily. Well, here it came, and just in time. The new body felt strange. He braided his unraveled hair and began to tidy himself up. This is his first assignment since the rebirth? There was a snide chuckle from somewhere. Chuckles. An invisible voice said it was right. In 72 hours, he has to kill the person who's causing violence in this school. A strange silhouette of some mythical creature resembling ancient Asian gods appeared from somewhere. In a squeaky voice, he kept talking. For the protagonist, a man who was the best assassin in his previous life, it's a simple matter, isn't it? The man, as if he didn't mind the teenagers who were looking at the teacher who had suddenly risen from the dead, said that he could prepare the next task for him. At this time, the teenagers could not understand how it happened that the teacher, who had just been lying there, was now as good as new. Taking a small chemical flask, usually used in school experiments, the man began to examine it. In a cold, emotionless voice, he said that in 30 seconds, all the people who are here. He paused for a rhetorical pause and said that in 30 seconds everyone here would die. The man began to pour the liquid and the staples evenly into another larger flask, which already contained an incomprehensible yellow substance. Wei didn't understand what was going on. What's he saying to himself? Is he laughing at him? The little deity behind giggled. No one present could notice it, but at the same time as it saw everything. The little beast looked at the flask in which the combustible mixture had already begun to bubble and chuckled echidically. The laughter continued to echo in its head, the first rule of their contract. With the exception of the object of the task, the protagonist can, by circumstances and his own initiative, to take out other people, otherwise his death will be final and irrevocable. At this time, the chief torturer rolled up his sleeves and glared furiously at the protagonist, who suddenly dared to interrupt his celebration. The boy shouted that the man had better not make him angry. It was clear from his look that he was serious. Wei lunged at the man with his fists and screamed for him to finally die. The ancient deity watched this from the side and smiled. It was as if the man wasn't paying any attention at all. The flask of liquid, bubbling, finally flew to the floor from a violent jolt. The man began to reason out loud. He had been a law-abiding citizen all his life. Could he kill anyone? The flammable mixture began to slowly spill out of the flask, which was already flying straight to the floor. A moment more, and it would shatter. It would be hard to imagine the aftermath of the explosion. With a final smile, the man uttered one sentence, except that no one is responsible for accidents. The flask reached the end of its flight, and a second later, the room was filled with a monstrous explosion. Everything began to shake, and the air was filled with the acrid odor of burning. The man's eyes sparkled, and he asked himself with feigned surprise, "And when did this flask manage to break?" A drop of the explosive mixture hit Wang Wei's arm, and then he screamed in pain. The rattling mixture began to eat away, first his clothes and then the guy's skin. He screamed in pain, but there was nothing he could do now. The deity hovered in the air. The man decided to exploit loopholes in the rules to kill people. The beast hesitated, unable to find the right words. At the same time, behind him were the worried and frightened faces of the school children who had just witnessed the monstrous explosion. Finally, the beast came to his senses from his euphoria. This man is simply their perfect host. With him, their plan would be flawless. His face stretched into a predatory grin, Leo's teeth sharp. The man wrapped himself in a robe and strode forward towards the rest of the school. The girl who held the poor man over them screamed in fear. The demon laughed again. He turned to the man. He was right, however, if he implicated too many innocents, the assignment grade would be lowered, and it would affect his resurrection. The man turned an indifferent look to him. Innocent? He was interested in the word. The protagonist looked at his sudden companion with surprise. Was he talking about this gang of bullies? The man shifted his gaze to the group of students who no longer looked as brave as they had at the beginning of their celebration. Now, they were shaking with fear, watching in horror as the teacher they had just bullied turned into some kind of cyborg. Or is he talking about those who stand by and watch idly and think they have nothing to do with it? The man looked at the other students who were filming the whole thing. They disgusted him just as much. From the perspective of the assignment, with the exception of the specified target, all are innocent. The demon laughed his acerbic chuckle. Interesting standards he had. The demon said that they were indeed honored to receive such an assessment from the protagonist. Wang Wei, the guy who was first on the list of those who abused the poor girl, was now lying on the floor, holding his bloody arm. He was screaming in pain. He looked absolutely pathetic now. The guy turned to his own and shouted that he was now ordering them to kill this freak. He wants that teacher dead. But there didn't seem to be much enthusiasm in the faces of his associates. They were huddled somewhere in the back and didn't dare to step forward. The guys were scared. None of them wanted to be in their leader's shoes. But the punishment didn't last long. Wu Ji-si approached them with some incredible speed. The guys didn't even have time to notice his movement. Their bodies were pierced by a monstrous pain. The blow was so strong that these bastards' bones were banned. The man, after a few seconds, was already standing by the window. The teenagers ran out of pain, their bodies as if paralyzed. They fell to the floor, unable to get back up. The man didn't even turn around to look at them. He just adjusted the sleeve of his robe. The students are helping their classmates and no one's stopping them. And they're also storing illegal goods that could be used to make quicksilver. That was very interesting. If the method used by the target of his assignment to incite violence is incitement, then there is a good chance that his target is not present in this crowd. The man approached Wei and put his foot on his wounded arm. The guy started screaming in pain and swearing. The girl in his group looked on in horror, but did not dare to move. The protagonist shifted his gaze to the other girls, including this student who was the victim of bullying. She only looked at her teacher with a frightened look, trying to cover her naked body. Besides the fact that he doesn't need to implicate the innocent, he still has a time frame to find and finish off the target. That's funny. Suddenly, the teacher's and the student's gazes crossed. The man looked at the girl with surprise, his cheeks covered with embarrassment. He moved a little closer to the student and began to speak in a quiet, colorless voice. Who would have thought that they would see each other again so soon, and in such an environment? The man stepped even closer to her and gently ran his hand over her cheek. Her skin was incredibly soft. The girl looked at him with a frightened look. Right now, she didn't know what to expect from this man. In a quiet voice, the man said, "Let her thank her luck. Let her be thankful that he had just happened to be here." The girl looked at him with big, surprised eyes. She didn't know what to say. She had probably forgotten that she was practically naked, and just 2 days ago, he was the best assassin in the Dragon Country. The man looked down at the girl, and his gaze expressed some strange emotion. It was either contempt or surprise. It didn't matter to him at all who his targets were. Passages came to mind when he killed the most important officials of society. One of them was even Hitler. No matter who his target was, no matter how high up she stood in the hierarchy of society, in just 5 seconds she was killed in an accident. In addition, beautiful moments from his life came to his mind. When he was walking in a field completely covered with beautiful flowers, and next to the girl who belonged to his heart. He remembered the moment when their cubes had first merged in a kiss. The sensation was impossible to put into words, but now he was dead. The old him was dead forever. Nothing foreshadowed his death then. An invisible voice asked him if he wanted to be reborn. It was the same spirit that afterward he showed up and gave him a chance to find his killer. The man gave himself a sad and thoughtful look. He looked down at the floor, trying to remember passages from his past life, in which he had to kill many hundreds and even thousands of people. His whole life had been stained with blood. The spirit that had given him the chance to revive and right his wrongs appeared before him literally, if from whence he came. In a squeaky voice, he said that to reward his recent observation of her, he had decided to award the man his rank early. His voice was still as snide as ever. He turned away, already wishing he could leave this room where many events had happened to him. The girl looked at him with a surprised and frightened look, still trying to cover her nakedness. He opened the skill window in front of him with interest. The demon was still hovering in the air not far from him, and watched his ward's every move carefully. There was some kind of change on the plaque. It was a character panel. The main character's name, gender, age, and century of life had already been exhausted, but his knowledge had changed. He was now an apprentice. The man looked at the change in surprise. The man thought about it. Those skills weren't much use right now, but now they were limited due to him being low level. He had item evaluation skills. With them, he could now assess how damaged the items were, what they could be used for. The spirit leaned on his shoulder and chuckled and said that was right. After proper study, he would be able to move to the next level and gain more exceptional abilities. So he'd have to master them perfectly. It was as if the man was not paying attention to what was going on around him at all. But none of the students could understand who he was talking to. Suddenly, a surprised shout came from behind the door. It was a man's voice. The students were startled and started to turn their heads in different directions. After a few moments, the room was filled with many people. The principal was also there. As soon as he got here, the students started making excuses and saying that the teacher wanted to kill them. There were also many policemen in the room. The principal was furious. He looked at the teacher with bloodshot eyes. But it turned out he wasn't embarrassed by it at all. He was thinking out loud. So, here's the thing. The subject under study and the lifeline contains a brief summary. It won't be that hard to raise the skill. Only by attaining a deep understanding can one get in touch with the essence of the object under study. The main point of promotion is probably mastering the skill of observation. Unlike being a hired assassin, it is more of a skill that a scout needs, however. The man thought for a moment. At that moment, the headmaster was furious. He shouted that the man was fully responsible for what just happened. He shifted his gaze and applied the evaluation skill. However, it was quite suitable for his current assignment. The principal continued to rage and point his finger at him. A sign popped up beside the man. Principal, voyeurism addicts, head of classroom, being conscientious at first glance, in fact a pervert addicted to covert filming. Life, born in 1900, more. Degree of comprehension 15%. status of study learning, possibly the art of photography at the level of a professional. Wu Ji walked up to him and kindly put his hand on the man's shoulder. Tout twitched. He definitely didn't expect this turn of events. In a soft voice, the main character said that the director is correct. The man was surprised and frightened at the same time. What is he up to? There was no point in ingratiating himself with him. Someone must definitely be held accountable for today's incident. Wu Ji leaned close to the headmaster's ear. In a brief voice, he said that of course someone should be held responsible, except that it would be the responsibility for some photos that Principal Tak carefully kept on his PC. Hearing these words, a chill ran through the fat director's entire body. He didn't know what to say. He knew exactly what it was about, so he had to keep this conversation quiet. Goosebumps ran down the principal's back. How was this type able to know his secret? He laughed nervously. Was it breakfast now? Wu Ji averted his gaze and indifferently said, "It's just nothing. Just an ordinary accident." Wang Wei went on a rampage. What kind of accident? It was obviously the teacher's doing. Sick bastard. The boy couldn't believe what was happening. They can't just forget about it. The students screamed for Principal Liu to hurry this sick teacher up. He's carrying danger to the students. Suddenly, the student who had just been bullied stood up for her savior. She screamed that it wasn't like that. The teacher is a good man. He only did it for her. The principal saw the fact that the student was naked and blushed within seconds. He pointed his finger at her naked body so that she would pay some attention to how she looked now. After a second, the girl realized what she was looking at, and she tried to cover her nakedness. At one point, pushing the crowd that had gathered near the victims, another girl burst into the center. She had a look of fear and anxiety on her face. She ran forward and called the girl by name. It turned out that the victim's name was Ping Ping. She rushed over to her and started asking her if she was all right. That explosion scared the hell out of her. The girl looked at her friend in surprise, who seemed more scared than she was. But the girl with yellow hair kept reading. Oh my God! She had to go through so much to stand up for her. No wonder those freaks were targeting her. The girl with yellow hair was named Yu Lian. Ping Ping said she was fine. Suddenly, Wang Wei's rough voice rang out. He called out the principal by name, his mouth spitting out saliva with anger. The teenager looked at the principal with furious eyes. He wasn't listening to him at all. The boy held onto his wounded arm and looked at the flushed principal, who couldn't recover. The director didn't know where to go. Damn it! That teacher Wu Ji is just a soft-hearted whipping boy. If he intimidates him a little, it should be fine. But if he displeases Father Wang Wei, the money and priesthood he wanted so badly, I'll be lost to him forever. But the problem is, there are too many people here now. We have to make some kind of arrangement. Wang Wei spat on the floor and looked at the principal with a predatory gaze. He said, sincerely beginning to doubt his abilities. He still couldn't figure out such an obvious case. The guy pointed his finger at the teacher and the student, who were now practically half naked. Seeing their clothes, one could immediately realize that they were engaged in some obscenities that they happened to catch here. That's why the teacher covers his shame with anger. The guy had the nerve to lie, but to top it all off, he said the classmates could back him up on this. His eyes made him look kind of crazy. The boys looked at each other, hesitating to say a word. There was doubt inside them. What should they say now? They had seen with their own eyes how powerful the teacher was. Now, they truly feared for their lives. One of the boys began to speak timidly. He stammered and said that Wang Wei was right. What had just happened was the teacher's and Jiang's doing, and he began to ramble on and on about the story that their leader had put into their heads. Everything had gone right. The plan had worked, and now the principal was sure it was the teacher's fault alone. That's right. The classroom was a mess. A wry smile flashed across the principal's face. Now, things would calm down. He really didn't want to lose the patronage of this student's father. Now it would be easier for him to blame the teacher for everything. The man rushed over and started pointing his fingers at Wu Ji. The man was shouting that they weren't going to tolerate scum like them. The girl looked at the headmaster in astonishment, but she couldn't say anything. The main character also didn't understand anything. Yulian shook her head and shouted that she only believed her friend. She wasn't that kind of person at all, after all. Ping Ping was ready to cry on the spot right now. It wasn't like that, so why were they lying? Suddenly, the teacher's firm, masculine hands laid on her shoulders. Girls follow showing tears to the person they love. She was startled at how unexpected it was. The man continued. He said that girls should only show tears to dear people. They are these scum. The two friends looked at him and immediately blushed. Wang Wei was furious. His eyes were burning. He was ready to kill this Yu teacher here and now. This asshole can still do what he says? How can he compete with him? The man's face broke into a wry smile. Really? He pulled out his phone, which had all the pictures and broadcasts these freaks had managed to record. Since one cretin was smart enough to leave evidence of his bad deeds, there was no point in him repeating himself. The man showed the police and the principal all the evidence. Wang Wei was speechless. His phone? When did the teacher manage to steal it? His pants pockets were empty. Wu Ji was triumphant. His clan broke out into a smile. The shameless liars would be punished. He smiled as he realized that it wouldn't be difficult for him to bring these freaks to justice. The students who had so recently felt omnipotent and unpunished were now like wet chickens, and they just stood there with their eyes downcast, unable to say anything. The man muttered to himself under his breath, "See if they don't have an accident, as it happened to the leader." After these phrases, horror was reflected on the faces of the teenagers. The protagonist walked up to the principal and put his hand on the man's forehead. He only looked at the protagonist with a frightened look through his glasses, unable to say a word. At this time, the man continued to speak. He believes that the principal will make a good faith election. Isn't that right? Wu Ji looked down at the headmaster. His eyes seemed to glitter with cruelty. Looking at the teacher, the fat little man didn't know whether to hide in fear. He saw a ghostly figure forming behind the teacher's back, marking the end of time. He began to stutter, legions of goosebumps running down his back. When had he managed to become so scary? Why did the director now feel like death awaited him if he obeyed him? The headmaster stuttered, unable to say a single word. Finally, the man rose from his knees and looked at the students with a healthy gaze. For a second, there was silence in the room. Ji looked at him over his shoulder. There was coldness and calculating in his gaze. The student didn't understand. Something had gone wrong. Just a few seconds later, there was a slapping sound. The principal slapped the student with a powerful slap, and the student was speechless with surprise, his teeth seemingly flying out of his mouth. The kid didn't understand anything. What had happened? Up to this point, he had enjoyed unshakable authority even from the principal because his father was a powerful man. But now, things were not going according to plan. The principal shouted, "How dare he do something like this?" The man ordered security to escort him to the dormitory, and then he would contact his parents. 2 guards took the boy under their arms and led him to the exit. The student screamed with rage. He yelled at the principal. Did he really want his father's donations for the construction? But no one seemed to pay the slightest attention to the boy's lamentations. He tried his best to justify himself, but it was already decided. The principal quickly turned around to the rest of the students and yelled, "Don't stand there like pillars. They should be preparing for the next lesson." After that, the principal turned to the teacher and, with a look of trepidation on his face, asked what he thought about this decision of his. There was hope in the principal's voice. Wu Ji took out a piece of paper and tossed it out with the trash. He was sure the top would quickly figure out what was what and reward him for his outstanding service. It was inspiring. He had already sent a message of the heroic act of the Director of Public Education. To it, He had also attached his outstanding collections. The principal was horrified by this. The man fell to his knees and began to beg the teacher to change his mind. He was fooled to the end that the teacher was just kidding. If word of this got out, his life would be ruined. The student watched all of this and didn't understand a thing. When did the teacher have time to change so much? Her friend approached her and with a caring embrace offered to walk her to the dormitory. The girl nodded in agreement. She'd had too much excitement for today, and she needed to rest. The teacher calmly walked out of the classroom and headed towards his home. Wang Wei, who was being led by 2 guards, was simply furious. He definitely wouldn't let the teacher get away with this. Suddenly, he saw the same guy in glasses who had been filming it all along. That's when the bastard had another idea in his head. His eyes were red with anger, but it seemed not all was lost for him. Now, he was going to do something nasty again. His mouth stretched into a predatory smile, revealing white teeth. The boy was definitely up to something, and now he was fully and completely determined to avenge his teacher for this humiliation. He jerked his arms, breaking free of the guard's firm grip. The guy said he knew the way perfectly well and didn't need an escort. He had a kind of beastly face. Now, all he was interested in was getting revenge on that despicable teacher who dared to violate his hitherto unforgettable authority. Now, he would definitely bury him alive. At that time, the teacher was walking around the city. The weather was beautiful. The sky was painted in bright sunset colors. There were 71 hours, 35 minutes, and 48 seconds left to complete the task. Suddenly, there was a strange notification sound. A sign appeared in front of him, informing him that the Chi-Yu formation was 80% complete. The man stared at it carefully. From whence they came, a spirit appeared. In his usual snide manner, he chuckled and said, "Only the man took up the first task, as he had already brought Chu up to speed. He is indeed the most charismatic host he has ever met." The man turned to the spirit and looked at him questioningly. "A Chu formation? What does that mean?" The demon's face transformed and became more cunning. He began to talk. "In the worlds where he will be doing missions, a person who is fully committed to killing can turn into a monster called Chu. 80%. That means someone will die soon." The demon grinned, baring its sharp teeth. Chuckling his acerbic laugh, he said that he was extremely curious how many seconds the legendary assassin would be able to last against this feeling. The man smiled, and indifferently said that he too was curious as to what the creature was, and what it would feel like to kill it. The demon grinned. He said that as soon as a man saw one of them, he would immediately realize it. It was not an opponent a man could match. The demon grinned again. They continued walking through the evening sunlight and didn't even realize that someone was already watching them from the far window of the school. The creature, whose ugly figure was completely hidden by the semi-darkness, stood near the window watching the people who had come in. Its body was like that of an insect. All its limbs were crowned with sharp claws, and it had 4 wings behind its back. His mouth stretched into a predatory smile, revealing a grin. His eyes lit up, and there was only one phrase in his mind: kill. This creature only lived by feeding on the energy of slain victims. The man turned around at that spot as if he had noticed something. An uneasiness flashed through his heart. The spirit asked, "What's wrong?" The man was silent for a moment, looking seriously at the spot where he thought someone was watching him. Every second, he was completely focused. As a hired assassin should be, he had some inhuman reflexes. He turned his head back and said it was no big deal. It was time for them to get down to business. The demon companion grinned, and they moved on. Night slowly descended on the city, and bright pinpoints of stars began to light up in the dark sky. The windows of the buildings lit up, showing that even at night life continued in this city. The protagonist was sitting in a cozy room on a bed and thinking about something. The invited light conquered the whole space, giving the setting a certain mystery. To this, It was worth adding the fact that the fairy demon was walking back and forth across the room again. Looking carefully ahead, he ran a finger to his temple, summoning the ability window. The demon wondered, was he testing his abilities? If one wanted to live longer, one shouldn't use unfamiliar abilities. This was a bit unreasonable. He was taking such a risk of dying. The man applied the evaluation skill, and plaques with information began to stretch out from every object in the room. The protagonist began to study them with interest. Well, this ability had a 3-meter radius. He got up from the bed and walked around the room. The degree of understanding is limited by innate skills and memories. He looked out the window, behind which stood a small potted flower. If you combine the information you know in advance, you might get something interesting. The man looked carefully at the flower pot. In such a case, it is possible to obtain unknown data based on previously known information, and the new unknown data is beyond the limitations. A new plaque appeared in front of him, and he studied the bird droppings. The man squinted his eyes. The radius and time of use of the ability depends on his mental state. At the moment, the duration of use is about 5 seconds. Not that long. He tensed every muscle in his body to concentrate his energy to use the ability. Such overexertion even gave him a headache. He had expected to test what would happen if he used this ability on a specific target, but considering his low mental ability, it would be extremely unwise. He would only be able to expose himself that way. The demon approached him and grinned and asked, "Is he going to surrender?" The man raised his head and smiled. He certainly wasn't going to give up. There was a look of confidence on his face. There was no backing down. Well, quite not going to. He just needed one component. The man realized that he needed a completely safe man. He stood in front of the mirror and a countdown sign popped up in front of him. There were 54 hours and 21 minutes left. So the words about using the ability on a specific target applied to himself, where he was surprised at that decision. The man squinted and looked at his reflection carefully. What better material for an experiment than the dead man he was now in? A second later, his body felt like it had been pierced by a beam of energy. It was like nothing he'd ever felt before. His eyes widened on their own, and his awareness began to blur. In front of him was a completely naked man clothed in a sphere of energy. He saw the spiritual insides of himself. The name of the spiritual space, Wu Ji. The degree of mastery is 100%. In addition, there were also tables with information about the date of birth and occupation. The ability was missing. Due to the circumstances of death, the owner of the system can directly enter the memories of the former owner of the physical shell. The demon grinned and advised him not to do that next time. The protagonist was in some ephemeral space filled with strange, heavy energy. Directly enter the memories? Hadn't he already acquired his memories? The man didn't understand. What could have gone wrong? The spirit chuckled and said, "Let him check it himself now." Wu Ji gently touched the body that was inside the energy dome. In a second, he was pierced by a wave of powerful energy. His body began to burn. His awareness began to absorb the memories of the physical shell. He saw what this man was before he died. That's what he was talking about. After entering recollection, he could see from God's perspective all kinds of things from this person's past. The demon grinned again and replied that it was exactly like that. The proportion of unconscious information is much greater than that which people consciously store in their memory. If we judge from this angle, the white fog zone is just the information that this person did not perceive at that moment. The demon continued, but since the human brain is unable to process all the information, for the sake of preventing the collapse of the human shell, all the excess information is stored in short-term memory. A man scrutinizing what the owner of this body did in a past life. If there is, perhaps by watching he can find the very person operating in the shadows. On August 13th, in order to gain experience before his end-of-year interview, he decided to volunteer for 10th graders at summer school. His dream of becoming a teacher, he had to experience many hardships during his high school years. The man stood and waved good-naturedly at the passing school children. Back then, I only gave him up because of my teacher. He always helped him. The man was walking down the street, looking around, watching the students going about their lives. From then on, he decided that when he grew up, he would become a teacher like him, and he would help his students with everything. But suddenly, something stopped him. The man's eyes widened as if he saw something incomprehensible. Not far away from him, a heartbreaking scene was unfolding. Several teenage boys from high school were beating up a poor girl who was trying her best to cover her face with her hands, and her whole body was covered with abrasions. But the guys didn't stop. They beat her harder and harder. Unable to tolerate this attitude, the teacher ran up to one of the students and grabbed his arm to stop the punch. He yelled for the boys to stop doing that. Why are they hitting their classmate? But the student dodged and released himself and kicked the teacher in the jaw with all his might. At that moment, something clicked in the man's head. Maybe it was his broken jaw. Now, the guy switched to him and began showering the teacher's body with punches. The man covered himself with his hands and a hail of blows came down. The student screamed, "Where did this asshole come from? Why is he sticking his nose in other people's business?" The man clearly didn't expect this to happen to him. The man tried his best to defend himself and yelled that the guy shouldn't do that. Now his body was covered with abrasions too. Soon, he found himself in the principal's office, where both the student who had beaten the girl and the victim were present. The man's face was completely covered with abrasions from the blows. His eye was blackened. Leaning on the principal's desk, he shouted, pointing at the student, that students who bully their classmates should not be indulged. The man tried to prove the injustice. The director turned out to care absolutely nothing. The man put his chubby hand forward, stopping the protest. The fat man fixed his glasses on his nose and said, "Then let this student tell how it all happened then." But the girl looked down at the floor and didn't dare to say a word. It turned out that something was stopping her. She was very afraid. Her whole body was shaking. She was ready to faint. Wu Ji walked over to her and gave her a pat on the shoulder and said that everything was fine. Let her tell it like it was, and they would definitely help her. The girl shrank even more, tears spurting from her eyes. All this time she hadn't said a word. There was definitely something stopping her. The principal, with astonishing indifference, lowered his hand and said that since nothing had happened, everyone could go away. He turned to the man and, in a stern voice, said that next time, let him not say that he had not warned him. Let the man be more reasonable. The fat man's gaze became cruel. He fixed his spectacles again and said in a dull voice that if he made trouble again, no one could vouch for his career as a teacher. Many students were already crowded around the principal's office. Each of them was waiting for the denouement. Because such cases did not happen often in the school, everyone was used to constant bullying. But this was something new. Wu Ji walked out of the principal's office together with the girl. They had droopy faces. It was obvious that the man definitely didn't expect this. The injured girl's name was Xiao Kei. Another student immediately came over to her and gave her a pat on the shoulder and asked if she was all right. It was obvious that the girl was very worried about her friend. Xiao turned to the man and whispered apologetically to herself. The girl was very frightened and was unable to say a single word more. The main character just looked at her with a sad look. The next day, he was subjected to the same horrible treatment he could not even imagine. The students dumped a plate of food on him, and in the nightstand of the table he found a snake clawing at his arm. From that moment on, the man began to be bullied just like the rest of the weaker students at school. At this point, he hesitated. He had doubts about whether he really should continue to stand his ground. If he did so, it would only be to his detriment. If he doesn't cause any more trouble and makes it through summer vacation, he can go from being a volunteer to becoming a teacher. His years of effort could finally pay off. He looked up from his scythe to see the two students torturing the poor classmate again. All one has to do is look away from the children who are stranded, pretend to know nothing. It was incredibly difficult, but he still had no choice. After all, he is just an ordinary man in the crowd, and he has no way of helping all the children. But the man couldn't stand it any longer, and rushing to the girl's aid, he pushed the student away, who fell on the stairs. After that, he was back in the principal's office. The man was furious. He had done something wrong again. Why is it that whenever something happens, this teacher is always implicated? The director pointed his chubby finger at the man's broken face. He's already starting to regret taking him on as a volunteer. He's a magnet for trouble. The man stood there, saying nothing. And even though he realized that his actions wouldn't bring any results, but if he could just manage to improve Xiao Kei's situation even a little, it would be worth it. Suddenly, the girl gathered her strength and finally, in a long time, raised her voice. Her voice was shaky, but she started to speak. She pointed her finger at her abuser and finally began to speak. She said it was Wang Wei and his buddies bullied her, and the deputy just stood up for her. He went ballistic. He started denying everything I said about the girl. The director rose from his seat and asked again, "Is that what happened?" The girl nodded her head affirmatively. The girl nodded her head in the affirmative. The protagonist turned around in surprise at the girl and looked at her but didn't say a word. It was strange to him that she had decided to say anything. He didn't think his efforts would do any good. The poor girl smiled at her protector. It wasn't as rosy as he'd imagined. The bullying didn't stop, and the next moment a badminton shuttlecock flew into the poor girl and hit her in the forehead. It seemed that from such a blow one could even die. The girl started to pitch backwards and was about to fall on the wet asphalt. There was a soul-crushing scream of more. The teenagers crowded around again. They were watching another fight with interest. The teacher sat on his knees, looking at the poor girl. Cold drops of rain dripped down his face. Anger, resentment, and a sense of complete injustice raged in him. The man couldn't understand why these teenagers were so cruel to others. But there was nothing he could do about it now, since he was trivially outnumbered. Wang Wei looked down at him. The boy laughed with a thunderous laughter. It was as if he realized his impunity. The man continued to reminisce about his past life. If it hadn't been for his arrogance, if he hadn't meddled in other people's affairs, then maybe this freak's antics wouldn't have gone to such extremes. The man clenched his fist in anger. Anger was boiling up in him with renewed vigor. Another second, and he wouldn't have been able to contain himself. The man rose to his feet and stared lifelessly at the student. In a cold voice he asked, "Is this their handiwork?" The boy chortled as if mockingly and told the man not to talk nonsense without proof. Does he really want to get into more and more trouble? The man at that moment thought that it was his weakness that killed this innocent girl. He couldn't control himself any longer and pounced on the insolent man with his fist to punch him properly. So he asked for someone to, though one man let one man stop these bastards. But the master was outnumbered as usual. The boy was more agile, and now everyone started beating him. The other students watched all this with horror, but no one dared to interfere, for they were all afraid of being in the poor teacher's shoes. Soon, the sun came up outside and illuminated the entire nearby space. The new day had arrived, which meant that we had to hurry. The protagonist stood by the window, contemplating the peaceful scene. The countdown said he had just over 48 hours left. The spirit flew up to him and asked, "What are your impressions after the man learned about the host's past?" He replied indifferently that the man was a very naive person. He was very stupid, unable to understand all the intricacies of this mean life. He walked over to the table where there was a notebook and a pen. He walked over to the table where there was a framed picture of the main character. In addition, he was very weak physically. This man was incapable of fighting back against his opponent. He took the picture in his hands and looked at the happy face of a man dressed in a master's uniform. Though it looks almost exactly like him, it's completely different. This guy's going nowhere. But still, he was not disgusted with the protagonist. The man put the picture back down and looked ahead carefully. He thought, a man's last wish is certainly worth honoring. He ran a hand through his thick hair and stared thoughtfully ahead. The man left the room and strode forward with a firm gait. The spirit followed him and asked in a squeaky voice what he was going to do. There wasn't much time left to complete the task. If he couldn't find the target, he would surely die. The man stretched out in a smile. It turned out he didn't care at all. He just walked forward and didn't notice anyone around him. The demon laughed snidely. The weather was beautiful outside. The bright afternoon sun was shining its rays on the street, warming it with its warmth, without which no living creature could survive. A group of teenagers, once again doing their usual thing, bullying the poor students who couldn't fight back. This time, their victim was an innocent fat boy whom they held down and beat to a pulp. The poor boy was already completely covered with abrasions. He was pinned against the wall and he could not move, but only endured the beatings of his abusers. He begged them to stop. He couldn't take it anymore. But it turned out the guys weren't paying any attention to him at all. One of them said he was just faking it. Such a fat pig shouldn't feel the blows at all. There was another loud thud, and his fist hit the poor man's chubby belly, and he let out a groan. The guy took him by the head and disdainfully looked down at him. He pretended to apologize, but they should practice. If he earned Wang Wei's favor, his position would also increase noticeably. It was clear that the guy wanted to show off in front of his supposed superiors. When that time came, Fatty would also be promoted to head errand boy. The guy laughed. Suddenly, he felt someone's aura approaching him from behind. It sent a chill down his spine. The teacher's booming voice sounded. He was looking thoughtfully at the boy from behind, except that with his current skills, he's afraid he'll never amount to anything in his entire life. The boy immediately turned around and looked at the teacher in surprise. Hey, wait a minute. That teacher's not the same as before. Is there a problem in his head? He can't wait to get one too. The boy had already raised his fist to punch the teacher in the face. The guy didn't have time to do that. He was immediately hit with a powerful straight punch right in the nose. The bones crunched, like his nose was pressed right into his skull. Blood splattered in every direction. It was an unbelievable blow. The guy didn't expect that and flew backwards, hitting the metal pipes on which one of his accomplices was sitting. Bounced off to the side. Wu Ji lost a bruised fist. The blow was really strong. The body he was in was not adapted to such stresses. Now, after evaluating it on his own skin, he realized how worthless his gift was. The man looked at him with a contemptuous gaze. He felt his superiority. Several students were sitting at the table drinking alcoholic beverages, which was naturally forbidden within the school walls. But no one seemed to be embarrassed. Two guys were fighting. One was clearly stronger. There was an atmosphere of chaos all around. One of the guys was shouting, "Okay, let him hit. If that one wins, he can take a break next week." He finally dodged and hit his opponent with such force that he fell to the floor and almost lost consciousness. It looked as if several of his teeth had been knocked out. Everyone was delighted. Such a spectacle brought them physical pleasure. There was a clinking of bottles. One of the guys opened a bottle of alcohol and slammed it on the table. A guy with bright red hair angrily hit one of the fighters with a bottle with such force that it even shattered. He was furious. He had just lost a large sum of money. Why is he lying down? Let him get up and keep fighting. The guy was throwing punches at him, and the poor guy just covered himself with his hands to soften the pain. He begged for forgiveness, but he couldn't get up. That's why such people live in the world. Why do they, the weak people, have to endure their antics? The poor man lay on the floor, covering his head with his hands, and was tormented by such speculations. Why can't anyone save them? He begged for help from anyone to finally end his suffering. Suddenly, footsteps were heard outside the door. Everyone turned around, frightened. The doors swung open and the teacher appeared on the threshold. He stood shrouded in light like some medieval knight. Perhaps that was the case. The man looked at them with a stern gaze. Well, there he found them. His voice was calm and steady. He glanced around at everyone present to assess who he would have to fight now. The man began to descend the stairs in measured steps. The same guy with red hair turned around to him and looked towards the man in surprise. "So, this is Wu Ji?" There were students in his eyes. "What is it? Did he want to participate in their club activities?" The man didn't seem to be listening to him and just came closer and closer. "Major activity?" He saw several guys naked to the waist, squatting with their hands folded behind their backs like prisoners. In the center of it all was a guy in a brown t-shirt, who'd just been beaten up. No. The ringleader stood a little farther back, feeling his superiority. He snapped his fingers in anticipation of a quick reprisal. Teacher walked even closer to them and lifted the poor man to his feet. "Their skills aren't bad. Why can't they fight back against these bullies?" He looked at the two fighters who had just fought in the arena. The guy in the t-shirt gave him a surprised look. He said he didn't want to cause trouble, and besides, he couldn't handle it alone. The teacher bent down and said, "It's not that he can't fight them. It's just that he's decided it's easier to fight those who are weaker, and that way he doesn't have to overcome his fear." There was logic in what the teacher said. He's just a coward. When he heard those words, the boy clenched his teeth and opened his eyes wide in surprise. It was the first time he'd ever been called that. The boy was furious. What does this teacher understand? He leaned his hand against his chest and tried to justify his action. They are all minions of that bastard Wang Wei. They are the ones who decide everything on the school grounds. Even the teachers can't do anything about it. As a teacher, he can't help himself. Who is he to blame him? The teacher looked at them with an appraising look. The guy in the shirt asked in surprise, "What the hell is he telling them?" The guy would have liked to stick a cigarette butt in him and tell him to fuck off. He had contempt on his face. The guy seemed to like it. But the teacher stopped his hand in time and squeezed it tightly, so tightly that there was a crunch of bones. The boy was surprised. He had not expected such a repulse. His fingers loosened, releasing the cigarette butt, and the teacher deftly picked it up with his 2 fingers. Now, something interesting was about to happen. In any business, before relying on others, there are some things to consider, worth pondering what was within his own power. He kicked out his apprentice's arm to the point where he crouched down and cried out in pain. He was going to break his arm now, wasn't he? The boy opened his mouth to scream, and the teacher wasted no time in putting out the cigarette butt on his tongue. The boy was horrified. The teacher said in a cold voice that smoking is bad for your health. Didn't he know that? The student screamed in pain, his eyes wide with horror. The red-haired guy boiled with rage, but now this teacher had gotten his hands on him. He grabbed the bottle and prepared for a fight. His accomplices did the same. The teacher, as if not paying any attention to them, carefully rolled up his sleeve. A spirit hovered beside him. He said snidely that young people were so fearless now. The fighters watched in horror as the teacher massacred a whole crowd of students in a few moments. There were drops of blood all around. There was horror on the boys' faces. They certainly hadn't expected this. Now, they couldn't do anything but watch as their abusers were beaten. A few seconds later, the teacher was standing beside several defeated students. They were lying there, some of them groaning with more, some of them passed out. The teacher shook off the dust and walked closer to the boys as if nothing had happened. With his hand on the shoulder of one of the fighters, he said in a soft voice, "Can he see? It's already hard for me to do that." He did what he should have done. The student should think about what he should do too. After saying that, he went about his business without even turning around. There was a spirit hovering beside him as usual. He asked, "Isn't it time to return to the task at hand?" Together for the original host was almost complete. Wu Ji looked away with a disdainful look. It's not even close, and what he is about to do is not revenge at all. He walked briskly toward the cellar exit. Looking up at the sky, the man said thoughtfully that he wanted to remind other people of something very important. The ghost looked at him in surprise. The killer had changed character. That was funny. There was a look of incomprehension in the demon's eyes, but at the same time interest. They were moving towards the place of another massacre. There were already a few guys standing there who were again bullying the poor, weak schoolboy. One of them pinned the poor boy to the ground with his foot, and another tried to pull down his pants. The boy persisted and begged them to stop. One of his abusers smiled evasively and looked at his victim like a predator. Just like that, consider him unlucky. Next time he sees these guys, he'll remember to stay away. Behind his back was suddenly the dark figure of a teacher. They're just cockroaches, that's all. No matter how many you exterminate, you'll get one. There was a lot of garbage in that school. The boy was stunned, a look of horror on his face. The teacher appeared behind him so fast he didn't have time to react. The boy turned around and looked at the teacher in surprise. What was he doing here? The man replied that he had already gotten an impression of him. Seems like this guy was in class yesterday. Without thinking long, the student took a sharp rake, and with a swing he wanted to hit the teacher right in the neck with the sharp teeth. He shouted that the teacher should not dare to grease him. In an instant he swung his arm and with a single blow broke the rake in half. The sharp tines flew upward. The student stared at them in amazement, unable to believe that a man could have such strength. Taking advantage of the confusion, the teacher punched him in the jaw with all his might. There was a crunch, and saliva and teeth flew out of the boy's mouth. Blood spurted from his nose. The blow had been very powerful indeed. The boy flew off to the side and fell to the hard granite floor with a clatter. It seemed almost impossible to recover from such a blow. It was a wonder the students didn't lose consciousness immediately. The sharp rake nozzle continued to fall at a high rate of speed. A whistling sound was heard. The rake stuck just a few centimeters between the guy's legs. Another moment and they would have cut off his manhood. The students watched in horror. It seemed as if his whole short life had flashed before him. The teacher turned to the rest of the students and looked disdainfully at the two boys who were still left. They looked at the sudden visitor and asked, "Does he think it is not true that they are afraid of him?" Nearby, the bushes stirred, as if someone had been there and was about to crawl out. After a moment, that's what happened. More and more guys started appearing from the bushes. They were armed with clubs. Looks like it's the teacher today. He's bumping into their guys everywhere. They've been waiting for him here for a long time. Now they're going to see how the freak can escape? The rest of the students only watched in horror then as the teacher was surrounded by these freaks. It's horrible. He's all alone out here. Shouldn't we call the police? But someone stopped him. Be quiet. There's a danger of these guys getting even with them. We couldn't draw attention to ourselves. The guy with white hair, feeling his superiority, gave a wave to his henchmen, and they rushed at the teacher, waving their sticks. They were determined that now they were going to smear the teacher with mud, literally. Did he want to play hero? Dirt is dirt. You can't make a wall out of it. You can't make a wall out of mud. This phrase was firmly imprinted on the man's memory, and he shifted his gaze to the people who stood a little farther away, watching fearfully. The teacher ducked and knocked out one of the guys with one powerful leg kick. He hit exactly in the jaw. There was a crunch and the guy flew far back, but several others were already flying at the teacher from the backside, waving their clubs. The protagonist saw all of this perfectly well and deftly turned around and knocked out several guys at once with a single leg kick. He ducked and hit one of the students in the nose with his knee. There was a cracking sound and teeth and blood flew in different directions. Another guy was already coming at him from behind, swinging a huge wooden club. It almost reached the teacher's head, but he saw and felt everything perfectly. It was as if he had a sixth sense. But all of a sudden, someone beat him to it. Right in the guy's jaw came a boot. There was a crunch, and he flew far to the side. It was the same kid he dropped from the underground fights. He stood, breathing heavily, looking at the result of his actions. The offender lay on the ground, foam coming out of his mouth. He dares to speak out against them, and he is not afraid? The teacher looked at the student in surprise. For a moment, he had a flicker of pride for this boy. After catching his breath a little, the guy put his hand to his face and said he was afraid, very scared. But the teacher said that if he wanted to change anything, it would have to start with himself. At that moment, the boy had a confidence in his voice that he hadn't possessed until that moment. Something had changed a great deal. A group of guys went ballistic. Did they get blown away by the word? He decided to follow his teacher. Doesn't he see how many of them are here? The guys were furious. They were determined to bury those bastards who dared to stop them. Suddenly, an uncertain voice came from somewhere. Another boy approached them. Overcoming his fear, he held firmly to the rebar with trembling hands and said that he intended to help them too. The teacher and the student looked at him in surprise. This kid was rather puny and weak in appearance, but now he was not afraid. He looked toward the rest of the students who were starting to come closer and closer to them. Incredibly, these people were beginning to show courage too. They came closer and closer, huddled together. They're finally starting to get it. They too were determined to help the teacher. His dedication had inspired them, and now they were determined to fight back against these tyrants. The main man in their gang ordered his henchmen not to be afraid, for there were simply more of them. The boys gritted their teeth and gripped the rebar tighter. But something changed. They seemed to begin to doubt. The exclamation wind changed. The teacher smiled and looked at the fact that the gang was now outnumbered. The boys had no trouble dealing with them. It turned out they weren't as scary as they thought they were. The spirit flew up to him and hurried to spoil all the fun. It took a long time to get involved in this school drama. What does he plan to do next? Wu Ji looked at him obliquely with a dissatisfied look. The other students were simply shocked. They looked at what was happening with surprised eyes. None of them could believe that such a thing was possible now. The teacher walked in front, and the student in a t-shirt walked beside him. Behind them were the beaten members of Wang Wei's gang. Now they had experienced what it was like to be bullied. The teacher soon came up to the celebrant himself. Behind him stood the beaten henchman looking down at him, muttering something to himself. Wang Wei was furious. He couldn't believe that he had been rebuffed. Right now, he was ready to fall to the ground, not only from anger but also from shame, because this meant that his authority had been shaken. What did that teacher do? The teacher walked up to him with a calm gait and tapped him on the forehead with his knuckle. These students had started a fight on the school grounds, and now he was taking them to his office for a talk. Wei's rage boiled over completely. His eyes became bloodshot. Those who followed this teacher will see what will happen to them when he brings order to this place. The guy in the jersey put the rebar on his shoulder and said they'll see him again. No one here is afraid of him. Wang was shocked. He just slammed his anger-red eyes, unable to say anything. It was like everything inside him was mixed up. He couldn't believe that no one was afraid of him now. The teacher simply walked past him, pushing him away with his shoulder. The boy could barely keep his feet from falling. He was still in a deep stupor. He didn't understand what had changed. Why had this teacher suddenly rallied so many people around him? Wei took hold of his wounded arm, which now showed blisters from the burns. His eyes lit up with blood. He naturally ground his teeth to a grinding sound. Fury overwhelmed his entire body. Now he looked as if the devil himself had possessed him. He was furious that the authority he had worked so hard to gain was now crumbling before his eyes. The next day, the school heard the news. That bastard's gang was finished. No one could believe it was possible. Now the students could breathe easy and not worry about being bullied. Now, the teacher had acquired a cosmic authority. Everyone watched him with admiration. He had rallied almost all the students around him, and now everyone looked up to him as an idol. Only Wang Wei's gang strangely didn't share this view. They stood in the school and watched the teacher reap the rewards. One of his henchmen asked, "Are they going to put up with this crap?" After what the teacher did to them, how do they get back on their feet? Where has their credibility gone? Wei shouted that he knew it all too well. The hand he'd recently burned was itching terribly, and he was scratching it furiously. The gang leader pointed his finger at the boy with the glasses and asked furiously, When will everything be ready? When will he be all that much more? The poor boy stammered and began to speak. He needed a little more time. What Wei is asking for is very heavily guarded. After that, a powerful punch followed. Obviously, he didn't like the answer. Son of a bitch! The guy didn't have time only to exhale heavily. It seemed that with this blow, his soul was about to come out of him. Wang Wei ran up to him and grabbed his hair. Just let him not think that the teacher can help him. His ancestors work for Wang Wei's father. If he doesn't obey, then he knows the outcome. There was a slap, and the poor man fell to the floor in pain. He crawled to the bastard's feet and wailed that he'd get it all. Just don't let him involve his parents. The kid was almost crying. He was in a completely hopeless situation. The red-haired guy spat nervously and said that they couldn't wait for the plan to work. Maybe they should just go and finish this dog off. The bully's chief assistant gritted his teeth and was ready to lunge at them like a dog protecting its master. But the boy stopped him. He indifferently told him to hammer these people. Walking over to the window, he began to watch the students crowded around the teacher again. It wouldn't hurt if they gave him a little surprise before their big one. At this time, the students crowded around the protagonist, and they were simply delighted with the new teacher. It seemed that this man had changed literally before their eyes. Girls circled around him and asked him why he was so cool. What kind of martial arts does he practice? Everyone thanked him for saving them. A demon was flying next to him as always, and he didn't share in the excitement. The cost of his childish games was the loss of most of his time on the mission. He decided to play hero and then go to the afterlife? That's funny. A plaque appeared in front of the man, proclaiming that Chu's formation was 98% complete. He grinned. If he didn't do anything about it, he might as well start looking for a replacement for the man already. After all, in about 2 hours, Chu would be fully formed. But it turned out that the man didn't care at all. He turned away from the annoying ghost and said that he knew what he had to do. The spirit was pleased and said cheerfully that that was another conversation. The man opened the door and walked slowly into the classroom. He had the same calm and peaceful look on his face. The students were already waiting for him there. As soon as the teacher entered the classroom, everyone stared at him with grateful eyes. He walked up to Pin Pin and, holding out his hand to her, asked if she had time to talk. The man tried to be as friendly as possible. Her friend nudged the poor girl and answered for her that, of course, she had time. The poor girl turned completely red with shame. She had no choice but to get up from the table, and on trembling legs she approached the teacher. The spirit was beating around him at this time, but it was as if the man didn't notice it. After all, he had given him the unique ability to be reborn, and he's using it to flirt with a woman. That's just ignorant. And the assignment? The mission. The spirit tried to shout to the man, but he paid no attention to him. Is he really neglecting him? The man replied that it wasn't like that. If this girl was really who he thought she was, then she would be the highest variable in their assignment. The sun was nearing sunset, and the sky was once again colored in bright, warm tones. A teacher and his student were walking down the street and talking peacefully. The man asked her, at what point did Wang Wei and his company start harassing the girl? It wasn't like that. Although these scumbags were already up to all sorts of mischief, their actions had never gone this far before. The man shifted his gaze to her and smiled, looking at the girl with some warmth. She was instantly embarrassed. She immediately started fixing her hair and, blushing, she asked, did she have something on her face? The man smiled and said her face was beautiful as usual. Some spark flashed in his eyes. The student had never seen that before. He approached her almost closely and, looking directly into her eyes, asked her if she knew him before the incident. The girl did not know what to say and blushed even more. An incredibly beautiful girl in a black dress was looking at the protagonist. She was strikingly similar to that very student. Without hesitation, the girl forcefully stabbed the knife into the chest of the bald man, who immediately choked on his own blood and fell to the ground. So this is him, the #1 ranked assassin? The protagonist stood a little behind and said with incomprehension that it was probably yes. The girl began to speak with some disdain. Laughable. Only an idiot would hire Killer based on his position on this wretched list. If he gets in her way, she'll poison him after the targets, even if it's against the top's interest. The man snatched the knife from her hands and put it to her throat in a flash. He smiled and said he was glad they had reached an understanding the first time they met. The girl smiled and held out her hand to look at the protagonist. She's as friendly as the rumors said she was. The man said it with a kind of irony. They took their hands and walked straight into the hall, which was already filled with bright yellow light. Friendliness can only be maintained between men of equal strength. In that case, he must be the only man in the world to have won her favor. Suddenly, the man was distracted from his memories by a strange noise that sounded like an engine. Somewhere nearby, a motorcycle stopped and a gloved man began to cut the electrical wires. The man continued to hold the girl, who was already flushed and embarrassed. She was very frightened. Was the teacher going to do something indecent? The man came almost close to her face and asked in an intimate voice if she had anything to say to him. A passage came to mind as they danced together at a ball to beautiful music. The man began to run his hand over her beautiful thigh. The woman didn't seem to mind. Their faces approached each other almost closely. The girl said 4, 6, and 7 o'clock, 2 in each direction. The boy replied that she had 2. Suddenly, 2 pistols appeared out of nowhere in their hands. The pair retreated in different directions, and raising the pistols began shooting the enemies. Everyone around them was horrified. Their hands parted, but the music continued to play. The sight was truly mesmerizing. They entwined again in a dance and began to spin around, shooting everyone around them in a circle as they did so. The sound of pistol shots mingled with the music to form some kind of madness. The girl leaned back and was in a kind of ecstasy. At this moment, the bullets pierced through the heads of the enemies and they fell dead. Finally, the music ended. The couple stopped, holding their pistols in their hands. Beside them were many bloody corpses. The picture was truly mesmerizing. The man looked at his companion with a kind of amorous gaze. There was an inexpressible warmth in his eyes and an admiration for this marvelous grace and elegance. The woman averted her gaze and looked somewhere off to the side. From this angle, her face was beautiful. White skin and light makeup that made her face look more defined. The teacher stood leaning close to the student and studied her face, trying to find familiar features, but in the end, sighed disappointedly. At this time, she was finally at a loss for words. She didn't know where to put herself from embarrassment, and yet, it wasn't her. At this moment, the cut high-voltage cable was flying straight at them. A couple more moments and there would be only a handful of ashes left of their bodies. But the protagonist caught up in time and picking up the girl in his arms in time to bounce out of the line of danger. But it was too early to rejoice. The motorcycle, which was lowered from the brakes by someone's caring hand at full throttle, carried straight to the main characters. The echidna spirit laughed and asked the man if he could cover her up first. The girl was still clinging to him and looking around in surprise, not sure what was going on. A mass of water flew at them from the heights. Someone had knocked over a bucket of water on the roof. Water poured out onto the spot where the man and girl had just stood, crackling. If they had been there, their lives would have immediately come to an end. The man watched in amazement as someone's evil plan failed. The motorcycle was approaching them at a rapid speed. A second more and they would be smeared on the road. The annoying demon opened the sign in front of him and muttered sadly to himself. Yes, he would have to find a new host after all. The man grinned and pressed the girl, who couldn't understand what was going on around her. Who was hunting them like this? Her cheeks were getting redder and redder by the second. The man smiled and said that when a spirit said such things in front of him, it really hurt him. The motorcycle was approaching them, picking up speed. Energy threads began to form around the man, which after a second approached the roaring motorcycle. In his hands, it was as if he was holding a ball of unknown energy. It was from this ball of energy that the red threads were spreading. One of these threads ripped a small hose from the motorcycle's fuel pump. A click was heard, and a small fire spark emerged from somewhere. This was the apprentice's first skill. A boundless ocean of knowledge. The man snapped his fingers, and at the same moment a deafening explosion sounded behind his back. Nothing was left of the motorcycle. Finally coming to my senses, I turned my startled eyes to the burning motorcycle. What was that sound? Why had the light suddenly disappeared? What just happened to her? Looks like the teacher moved his hand a little and then there was an explosion? That's all before the gasps of surprise began. A lot of people had heard some strange explosion and now went outside to see what had happened. The girl looked at the teacher with surprise and now some fear. Who on earth was he? The man looked at her in surprise. Smiling, the protagonist looked away. An ordinary passerby, that's all. He was trying his best to avert suspicion, or maybe he was just showing off. Windows began to open from everywhere, and the surprised faces of passers-by began to look out of them. What exploded? That was quite a noise. Does anyone know what happened? The faces of surprised students began to appear. Each of them wanted to know what had happened. A fire started spreading outside. People shouted in panic for someone to put out the fire. And where did the power supply go anyway? The dark corridor was both inviting and frightening in its obscurity. It led to a chemical laboratory, and in the darkness of the corridor there were timid, frightened footsteps. Someone's hand carefully closed the door so as not to arouse suspicion. In the other hand was a vial with some kind of contents. It was the same kid with glasses. He was looking fearfully at the door of the chemistry lab, holding a vial of contents, probably just what Wang Wei demanded of him. Ping Ping was sitting in the room with the teacher standing next to her. So the real teacher is already dead, and he has borrowed his body and is helping them resolve the issue with the person who is secretly inciting violence? The man nodded his head. It was exactly like that. The girl was amazingly guessful. She was still trying to make sense of what she had heard, the thoughtfulness on her face betraying her disbelief. The spirit hovered beside him, puzzled, and this man just went and told the first person he met? The man replied that the rules didn't forbid it, did they? The spirit shouted that no sane person would believe it, but then the unforeseen happened. The girl clenched her hand into a fist. From full confidence, she said she understood everything. She also had a request. She asked the man to let her help him. Spirit was shocked. Did she just believe it the first time? The man looked at her in surprise, a smile flashing across his face. He asked if she was worried that what he said might be a lie. The girl replied that the difference between him and the former teacher was indeed too great. Besides, what was the point for him to deceive her? Money? She's just an orphan? Obscenity? She looked away. There are much easier ways to do this. The girl said she trusted him, so let her help him. The man smiled. That's how. Great. He just needs help with a small matter. The girl looked at him with confidence and said, let him hear say, what's the matter? Suddenly, the man moved closer to her so that the girl flushed again. He looked into her eyes and said, in that case, let her take care of him. Here comes the second skill of the apprentice, thought connection. A fire aura began to form around the man. Even the girl felt it. The jet of energy that came from the man went straight to the girl's head, and as if pierced her brain with an arrow. She didn't expect it herself, and she didn't know what to do in such situations. Her head felt as if it was being filled with new information that she was unable to comprehend. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't take her eyes off the teacher. Just like that? The spirit was surprised. The next day, the teacher came back to school as if nothing had happened. The little demonesses hovered around him. The man asked, why, is that weird? Of course it's weird, the spirit chuckled. To go to the depths of thought space whenever your soul desires? In creating man, they drew his distinctions into the ego part, representing the harmony of spirit and matter, the superego, responsible for moral attitudes, and the subconscious, representing the totality of instinctual drives. For the thought of entering another's thought space, it is first of all necessary to gain the approval of the ego of the opposite party. This requires strong sympathy from the opposite party or its death. Then, one must resist the innumerable limitations imposed by the superego. These were the shackles of morality, worldly prejudices, strong bonds and laws and regulations, as well as strong emotions. Only by breaking all these chains was it possible to find the subconscious mind. Finally, one must avoid the influence of the purest primitive impulses and animal passion of the subconscious. Only after all this can one begin to explore the thought space of the other side. He was able to enter the deepest of spaces. In other words, this girl doesn't have the limitations of a superego? Is she a saint by birth? The spirit grinned. Ping Ping covered her friends with her hand and putting out a stick shouted to keep away from them, or she would not be ceremonious. These were the same guys who had bullied them earlier. Now they looked at her scornfully and turned and walked away. The spirit watched from the sidelines and said with a grin that she was indeed a saint. Smiling, the girl turned to her new acquaintances and said that everything was fine now. It's all over now. The girl said her name was Jiang Ping Er, but what are the names of these two? The girls looked at each other and looked at her with surprised looks. From that moment on, they became friends. Now it was Trinity who went everywhere together. It made it easier to fight back. They went to the canteen together, and now everything didn't seem as scary as it really was. It was much easier to overcome difficulties together. It brought to mind and the moment when one of the girls was badly hurt and when the previous teacher wanted to stand up for her. The protagonist squinted his eyes. This memory was making him uncomfortable. He didn't want to remember that unpleasant moment. My eyes opened on their own and a girl's figure appeared in front of my face. From this angle, her breast looked even bigger than usual. She looked at the teacher with surprise. The man rose quickly, rubbing his head, which suddenly began to ring with pain. Looking at him, she began to speak in a worried tone. She said that the teacher had suddenly fainted. He also said to take care of him. The only thing the girl could do was to put him on the bed, more or less. The man lost his head and slanted to the side. His head was still ringing, but it was much better now. He turned back to the girl. Did she have any other questions for him? Like what just happened, or if he was able to find any leads? Doesn't she care about anything else? But I think that's what happened. The girl said with confidence that she knew he was a good man. She trusts him. If there was anything she wanted to ask, it was if she was able to help him. The man looked at her in surprise. This was something he certainly hadn't expected. The spirit chuckled. The chastity of this girl was simply disconcerting. The man stroked her head. Yes, she helped him. He was already able to figure out the purpose of the assignment. The girl looked at him with surprise, and hers also became covered with blush again. The purpose of the assignment is... The man paused rhetorically, still not daring to say a word. The spirit hovered around him and tried to ask what he had figured out after all. The girl was also very surprised and a little scared. The main character slanted his eyes to the side. A spark flashed in his eyes. He really understood everything. The spirit looked at him in surprise so quickly. Normally, the target would hesitate once after time before finally transforming into Chu. This was simply unbelievable. Formation is 99% complete. Countdown clock 42 minutes. Men applied a boundless ocean of knowledge. His lips slowly moved, and once again the red thread spread, reaching out to every object in the room. So that's what this is all about. He grinned. By obtaining the anomalous information, he was provided with the properties of the objects. He was able to determine Chu's plans and actions. But why didn't he use it to find the target of the mission? Had the rank ability failed? The man fell silent and looked ahead with a pensive gaze. He stood up and walked briskly toward the exit. The student jumped out of bed and ran after him. She didn't understand where the teacher was going. Had he realized something? Since the girl was already a direct participant of all the events, I wanted to know everything in detail. The guy held up a beer bottle to the card. It was good stuff, the guy smiled, wiping his face with his fist. The smell of beer spread throughout the class. But suddenly the kid went crazy and threw the bottle, which was already empty, right at the boy with glasses. He didn't have time to dodge, and the bottle hit him right in the face. But does he really think buying them booze is going to get him off my back after I got what he asked for? The bully was pissed. That guy was trash. Trash. Y grabbed him by the throat. The guy started to wheeze, but the bully didn't stop. He had already prepared his weighty fist to strike the innocent victim once again. But then, the classroom door opened, and the teacher appeared on the threshold. Next to him, there was a frightened student who looked at all this with horror. In a calm voice, the protagonist ordered him to let the boy go. But his face had taken on some beastly features. It was too late. The guy was already celebrating his victory. From this angle, he looked like some kind of demon, certainly not an ordinary schoolboy. It took on some strange shapes and began to deform, tearing his clothes. He shouted that the teacher could admire how his student was about to die. The bastard was triumphant. But suddenly the unexpected happened. The boy wheezed and started coughing, spitting the drink out of his mouth. He had a strange flavor. His throat felt like it was constricting, and his insides were on fire. The brat started coughing up blood like he'd been poisoned. With his last strength, he began to wheeze. The other guys who had also tasted the drink also started coughing up blood. They fell to the floor. The picture was horrifying. There was blood everywhere, and people choking on it. Y fell to the floor, still vomiting blood, and the boy with glasses just stared at him callously. Now, no one could hurt him. In the end, the main degenerate of the school fell to the floor, seemingly not even breathing. His eyes rolled back, and a small trickle of blood continued to run from his mouth. The bespectacled man pretended to hold his head. Is he really dead? It was a rhetorical question. Tears of joy ran down his cheeks. He's dead. The bespectacled man threw his head up and put his hand over his face. He was stained with his classmates' blood, but it didn't seem to bother him at all. The boy threw his head back and burst out laughing madly. He laughed as if he didn't notice the people crowded around him. The boy was mad on the spot. Chu's formation was almost complete. The teacher looked at all of this with a calm gaze. The demon chuckled. It turned out that the one who had begun to transform was not Wang Wei, but this unassuming boy. Ping Ping covered her face with her hands to keep from screaming. The girl opened her eyes in horror. She was completely shocked by what was happening. The teacher, on the other hand, looked at it all with an inexpressible calmness. A person immersed in darkness would eventually be completely consumed by it. He ran up to the boy, and with one deft movement, his neck. Rest in peace. There was a crunch. The boy stopped laughing. His collapsed body fell to the floor with a loud sound. Now, he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone. The girl had already completely covered her face with her hands so she couldn't see the horror that was happening. She was not ready to realize that such horrible things could happen in her school. The teacher turned around and, as if nothing had happened, moved to leave the classroom. The poor girl turned to him and tried to call out to him, but the man interrupted her and calmly said that he was only crumbling over his fate. "Where did they come from?" came the demon's voice, still as snide as ever. He asked the man if he thought he could settle the matter by forming Chu. The man stopped and froze in place. There was a sickening sound of bones crunching. The protagonist turned back around and looked at the dead student's body. It began to deform even more, and his clothes began to tear, exposing his ugly body. A strange hump suddenly appeared on his back. It burst open, exposing the monster's ugly body. The crunching continued. It no longer looked like a normal student, and it didn't look much like a human either. His skin had darkened to a dark brown color. The boy's body continued to break down, and he was now completely deformed. Inhuman muscles were visible, the head turned upside down, hardened. The monster looked at the teacher. There was nothing human in his eyes. Only from a distance he resembled that he had once been human. The demon laughed. It looked like the protagonist was about to get into big trouble. The girl was already completely speechless. She couldn't understand what was happening. Her knees shook, and her heart began to beat at double speed. The man pulled his hand forward as if shielding her from what was happening, and ordered her to step back and stay out of the way. The monster had already taken its form, and now the man was facing an unusual student, some otherworldly creature hungry only for blood and endless violence. The man did not hesitate, and with great force he threw a sharp handle at it, which was aimed straight at the monster and flew forward with great speed. The man grouped himself and took a fighting stance, but to his surprise the pen reached its target and hit the eye. However, it had no effect. As soon as it touched the black eye of the monster, it immediately disintegrated into many pieces without causing any damage to the creature. The man was horrified. The creature reacted quickly and grabbed his arm. Its grip was really dead. It was only a moment before the man felt his bones crunch. The creature yanked him right toward it and threw him over to the other side with great force. The man went straight to the floor. Another second and he would break his back. The monster roared and its mouth stretched in a triumphant grin. But the protagonist was not going to give up so easily. He grasped his arm and in one fell swoop put the dislodged bones back in place. The man landed in a small distance. Here was the monster. Not only strength, even the speed of this beast had increased. Its physical shell had gained comprehensive enhancement. Strange. It would be much harder to deal with it now. The man applied a boundless ocean of knowledge to study the unknown creature. It didn't matter, even though it possessed unusual physical indicators. Its structure was still similar to that of a human. The creature, which had already taken its true form, began to rage. It threw chairs and desks in different directions. The classroom was already completely trashed. The man dodged every attack, but the monster was watching his every move. But it turns out that if this creature has a similar human build, then its weaknesses are right in the palm of his hand. The man dodged and jumped up. Suddenly, a magical spear materialized in his hands, which he immediately brought up to strike the creature with one precise blow. He took aim, a sharp object straight at the monster's ear. There was a crunch. The creature roared in pain, and drops of blood flew in different directions. It would never survive a blow like that. Burn. Its tip glistened. It was a lethal weapon that could kill even a demonic brat like the one the student had turned into. To the next target was the solar plexus. The man thrust the spear straight into the monster's chest with great force. The creature roared in pain even more. The next place to hit was the spine. If you broke the bone, the monster wouldn't be able to move, and that would make it easier. The creature's spine was reinforced by an outgrowth, and Just's spear bounced off of them with a clang. That was unexpected. The demonic companion was nearby, and the echidna asked, "Did the protagonist think that just hitting the monster's weak points would be enough? Is he really that naive?" His voice was filled with reproach and mockery. The monster lifted its head and stared lifelessly into the man's eyes. That look would have sent shivers down anyone's spine. Chu is a work of art that reflects the perfect release of the subconscious mind, each with distinctive attributes that are based on a person's cherished desires and impulses. The man bounced off the creature's back and covered himself with his hands to protect himself from any future blow. The monster straightened up and roared with renewed vigor. It fired several of its spikes at the man. They shrieked and cut through the air, passing over the man's body. A moment more would have been the end of him. He flew into the street. The impact was so hard that the man took out half the wall with his body. Now, there's a blanket in that spot, a big hole. The man found himself on the street, where worried and frightened students were already looking at him. Everyone looked at him with surprise. No one understood what had happened. The man was lying on the ground, his teeth naturally gritted, watching the monster break free. The monstrous arm of the creature had already begun to appear from the gap in the wall that was formed as a result of the blow. The demon continued to narrate. Among the monsters, the attribute that awakened this particular one was not considered that strong. But for a newcomer who is encountering one for the first time, he is quite unpleasant. The demon grinned again. The monster had already completely transformed, and now 2 large horns were visible on its head. The mouth had taken on a round shape, and now the monster looked like some sort of humanoid. The properties of this monster were not that extensive, but still the monster's strength exceeded that of a human by 10 times. With a monstrous roar, the monster broke through the wall and rushed straight at the protagonist. In his current state, there is no way he can defeat an opponent whose physical properties are beyond human limits. At that time, the man was lying on the floor, trying to recover from such a crushing blow. The demon asked him what he was going to do now. The poor girl wrapped her hands around her face and watched in horror as her school was being destroyed by the monster. She screamed for someone to call the police. This was the first time she had ever faced such monsters, and now she didn't know what to do. The monster saw its victim. Its eyes lit up with red lights, and its mouth began to move. From the monster's mouth came a wrenching roar like a mixture of human and animal voices. The monstrous creature was already just a few meters away from them. The man still couldn't regain consciousness, but he had to act without delay. In a few seconds, the monster would crush them. The man finally came to his senses and rushed over to the girl to push her aside, as he saw that the monster had already swung its huge paw to flatten the poor girl. The man covered him with his body, and the monster hit him right in the arm. Bones cracked, blood spurted in different directions, and magical energy began to ooze from the wound. He gritted his teeth in pain, but he couldn't back down. The monster roared, and where there had been a hand, there was now only a bloody stump. The man jumped to the side, dodging another blow. The girl watched with her eyes wide open in surprise and horror. She couldn't believe that her teacher had such powers. After all, until now, he was just an ordinary person. The man took the full impact and flew far to the side. Pain shot through his entire body, and the monster continued without staying. The protagonist held onto his severed arm. More spread throughout his body like needles. Eventually, the man crashed into a nearby trash can. There was a crash. A spirit appeared beside him. He asked the man, "Is he surrendering? In that case, let him lie down and allow him to carry out a carrier swap, a round, which the man raised by his fall." Finally, he stood up and turned to his demonic companion. In an annoyed voice, he said that he had said that trying to change the feeder right in front of him was beyond obscene. The monster had already noticed that his victim had risen to his feet and had already rushed to finish the man. Is he still able to do anything? The man focused his attention on the monster running towards him. Recently, he had discovered something very interesting in his body. The very same red thread began to emerge from his wounded arm. They moved closer to the monster and embedded themselves into his body. The demon didn't understand. What the hell is going on? The man stood, firmly on his feet. It was a boundless ocean of knowledge. It was as if his body was covered in magical energy. Physical reinforcement beyond human limits could cause the body to collapse. The little demon didn't know what was going on? What kind of joke was this? Using an attribute on a human body? If he wanted to die by being torn to pieces, there was no need to drag him into it, and with blood and flesh too disgusting. But the man didn't listen to him at all. He said he wouldn't get rid of him that easily. The monster had already brought his huge fist over him to deliver a crushing blow, but the man applied a boundless ocean of knowledge. The red threads from his body spread to the many animals that were nearby. A gecko, possible study of tail flapping; field sparrow, possible study of mating plumage; plaster, possible study of crumbling; pine, possible study of germination; The man's body began to deform as well, his severed arm regenerating literally before his eyes. His clothes were torn away, revealing bare muscle. His arm slowly began to flesh out, the bones reassembling. The monster continued to roar with rage. It brought up its huge fist and prepared to deliver a crushing blow to its victim to finally finish the man off. The demonic companion of the protagonist watched in amazement as the man's body recovered and steam began to emanate from him. But even so, an ordinary man would not be able to endure the pain of rebuilding shattered bones and muscle tissue. This man's willpower is truly terrifying. The man put out his fist and the monster's fist slammed right into him. There was a sound that was like a thunderclap. Sparks flew out in various directions. The impact was monstrously powerful. The force was so enormous that a sound wave flew in different directions. It tore down everything in its path. Windows burst, alarms began to go off, and huge chunks began to burst out of the ground. G jumped up, hitting the monster straight into its back with all his might. Even though he had used outside skills to suppress the negative effects of the ability, but how long would his body be able to withstand such a strain? A minute? Half a minute? The demon still didn't believe the man's ability. G bounced up to dodge the monster's powerful punch. Two huge fists came down on the ground and there was a rumbling sound. Rocks flew in different directions. The man realized that he would only last about 10 seconds at this rate, but still, he had to make the most of it. The monster was already swinging to deliver another devastating blow. Realized that even those 10 seconds would be completely enough for him. He came back, and with all his might, he kicked the creature right in the head. With such a powerful blow, the monster flew to the side, leaving a furrow of earth behind it. It was still on its feet even though the impact was incredibly powerful. It wasn't enough to take down such a powerful monster. The monster turned its head to him and gave him a surprised look. The monster wasn't used to being able to fight back like this. The man didn't waste a moment, and in a few leaps he approached the monster and delivered another crushing blow, which sealed the monster's head directly into the ground. The tiles rattled and began to rise up. Only 8 seconds left, and his demonic companion was watching from the sidelines. Even so, the man's strength wasn't enough to kill such a thing. The man jumped up and brought his fist up for another blow. He's up to something. What if there were two like him? The man jumped up to the topmost floor of the building. It was simply unthinkable. He had long since crossed the barrier of human ability. The severed arm was lying on the floor. 6 seconds. The demon looked at it in surprise, and what was he up to? The man jumped up, completely forgetting the severed arm. The stricken hand immediately reared back. He clenched his fist again, preparing to deliver another earth-shaking blow. He concentrated all his power in this fist. He had no margin for error. 5 seconds left. 4 seconds. The man was already beginning to physically feel his body begin to disintegrate from the monstrous overload. The demon was watching from the sidelines. He opened all 3 of his eyes in surprise. Did this guy concentrate all his power in one hand? The protagonist's arm began to form strengthening growths, similar to what the monster's body was covered in. 3 seconds left. The body was literally already burning from the overload, but the man didn't even think of retreating. The monster was on all fours, unaware that his death was coming down on him from above. 2 seconds. The man had already thrust his fortified arm forward and down like a meteorite at a monstrous speed. There was an explosion, as if the fighter had broken the sound barrier. The monstrous force shook the creature's spine. The man still reached his target, and with a single blow, he pierced through the monster's body. The monster wheezed, the very spike that had been used to secure the man's arm sticking out of its chest. Now, his life was over. There was no time left at all, 0 seconds. The man was just in time. He landed on his feet, and behind him there was a cracking sound, and the debris of the building came crashing down. The dust seemed to have cleared, and the main character appeared in the debris. His clothes were already completely torn, only some rags remained. Next to him, A demonic companion was flying enthusiastically. He knew that there would be no problem with him. Now, all that was left was to figure out the purpose of the mission. The man fixed his hair and sighed heavily. A black tattoo in the shape of a flame had formed on his arm, which had just grown back. It's not that simple. At this moment, his physical condition didn't even reach 1% of the peak of his power. The demon purred and began wagging his finger. Given its abilities, it would be incredibly easy to kill an ordinary human even with 1%. However, with the current purpose of the assignment will not be so simple. The man didn't have time to speak. Someone called out to him. It was Ping Ping. She and the rest of the students were already running towards the teacher. She shouted that it was very good that the teacher was fine. The demon continued to taunt. How fortunate the man had succeeded on both fronts. The protagonist glanced at his companion. Hadn't he wanted all along to find out who the target of the mission was? The demon asked, "This man, what's here?" That was right. He was just right. But the man didn't have time to finish. There was a crunch of bones, and it was as if his breathing had been knocked off. The body of the protagonist was pierced by something sharp. As soon as the girl approached him at a sufficient distance, she, in the department, some incomprehensible object right into his hands. Blood spurted. At the last moment, a monstrous realization struck the man. He wasn't wrong about this girl after all. So it had been her all along? The girl was completely covered in blood. Her face had changed to a familiar shape. Who knew this man's naivety would turn out to be so adorable? That phrase sliced painfully into his mind. The man's face contorted with a grimace of horror. He couldn't believe it was really happening. From his last strength, he grasped the shoulders of the girl who so skillfully pretended to be a student. Light footsteps were heard. Another girl approached them. She asked in a snide voice, "Is Assistant Wu okay?" It was the same friend who had been together with Pin Pin all this time. The girl had also transformed. Now she looked like a grown woman. Glancing at the man, she asked, "How does it feel to be killed by the knife of a trusted disciple?" The demonic companion of the protagonist stopped understanding anything himself. The students froze in place as if paralyzed. The girl continued to smirk. Why did she seem like a completely different person? Her face and everything else about her immediately changed. Now there was no trace of the former student. The man bandaged his wound to stop the bleeding. The wound was serious, but still, it wouldn't stop him from fighting. After bandaging his wound, the man said it was because this girl was the person who was secretly inciting everyone to violence. It was a decisive moment. It was impossible to miss it. The girl grinned. How frustrating to hear something like that. The man threw the shard of glass that had just been in his body at her. He had to kill this thing here and now, or it would continue its dark deeds. But suddenly, as if against her will, she was overshadowed by the very student in the green t-shirt who so recently had been able to overcome his fears. The splinter went deep into his chest, but he didn't make a sound because he was under hypnosis. The girl continued to speak in an angry voice. They were the ones who smugly broke into her Garden of Eden and ruined her toys. I could hear the fury and irritation in her voice. All the others who were here seemed to be under some kind of hypnosis. Their eyes were completely lifeless. It was like they were zombies standing there with their hands down. There's definitely something wrong here. The person the protagonist hit didn't make any sound. Such a huge corpse of a monster also doesn't surprise anyone. The demon was beginning to guess something. The woman grinned and said wryly that it was because she had hypnotized them. She had a wry smile on her face, as if she felt her superiority in the situation. That's what the Phantom didn't expect. She can talk to him? Unbelievable. The little ghost turned to the main character and sadly said that he seemed to have no luck at all right now. Looks like it's the girl originally and the host. No wonder his abilities didn't work last time. How much of a peerless specimen is only born in 1 in 100 worlds? Also possesses rank abilities. The man got tired of hearing all this and pushed the spirit aside. She's been preparing for this moment for a very long time, hasn't she? The girl continued to smirk. Not at all. You could consider the preparations to have started with that incident in chemistry class. The woman had planned the whole thing. She ordered her henchmen to attack the protagonist, and everyone standing around under hypnosis threw themselves at him. Besides, wasn't he trying so hard to get to her? After all, she's his adorable student. How could she let the assistant do everything by himself? The man bounced to the side, dodging the attacks. Easier said than done. In fact, she must be having fun watching her playground crumble step by step. A woman walked up to Pin and took her from behind. The assistant is so mean. Let him be careful. Girls don't like that kind of guy. She's definitely up to something else. Wu Ji fought off waves of surging, hypnotized students. He knocked them out one by one. These people were weaker than him, so fighting back was no problem. Do they go up after they've been knocked out? The demon wondered. How do they manage them? These people are like zombies. The man bent down and picked up a large, weighty stick from the ground. As long as they're alive, all they have to do is obey this girl's orders. But an assistant isn't allowed to kill people, right? The girl mocked him. She realized that a man can't kill a man without a reason. Control. Spirit was shocked. How did this girl have so much power in her? How did she know that the main character couldn't kill? The man kicked the student's leg with all his might. A crunch sounded, and the leg folded in half. The woman smirked and said as she watched him. It was obvious that he had plenty of strength, yet the man did not kill Wang Wei and his company. That's surprising. Was it because of his kind-heartedness? The students again and again pounced upon the teacher, but the latter deftly fought them off. His physical condition was many times greater than theirs. The woman said that she strongly doubted that such words could be applied to a man who had used rattling mercury to undermine those scum. Add to that the little cretin that's circling around him, and the conclusion is self-evident. For some reason, he can't kill her toys. It was starting to amuse her, and yet, time after time, he pissed her off, tried to find her, lure out her current incarnation. That's because the little twerp had assigned him some business related to her. Isn't that right? The spirit was shocked. It turned out that when the man saved those children from being bullied, he was not only playing the hero but also trying to provoke the target of the assignment. Let me see. She's the target of some mission. How seductive it was. The man dodged all the attacks. The schoolboys couldn't do him any harm. How clever. Does he want to die so the spirit can make a replacement host? The little creep grinned. The man deftly kicked another student and he flew off to the side. Apparently, this task had a time limit, among other things. Otherwise, in such a situation, he would have already retreated instead of rushing forward headlong. The woman had guessed everything. To the timetable. By the way, there's not much time left. 12 hours, 21 minutes, and 10 seconds. This lady was quite a curious specimen. In his current position, the man that he couldn't get through her toys. The girl continued to taunt him, while the man flew into the breach without a care in the world. He knocked out the students one by one, but he was careful not to critically injure them. He sighed heavily. To be honest, he was rather curious. If the girl only saw them as toys, why was Zhongping Air still by her side? It was a reasonable question. The woman answered without hesitation that it was because of love. She put her arm around the girl from behind and came close to her face. That was definitely not the answer anyone expected. The girl continued to squeeze her face. She said that she just loved her pious and proud look. She fell in love with her from the first time they met when she rescued her former toy, Xiao Ke, with that life-joyful smile, so she organized poisoned on her, humiliated her, and even, the man continued to speak for her, and even organized Xiao Ke's death? The demon had already stopped understanding anything. The man was fending off the attacks of the school children, but that didn't stop him from having such a conversation. So that girl wasn't afraid of the bully boy at all, but of her. The girl smiled, she nodded her head, it was just like that. I mean, she was just crazy. The spirit was going crazy. It was blowing her head up. The woman blushed with embarrassment or excitement. Well, excuse me, assistant, if he had shown her a nice kneeling stance, maybe she might have shown him some leniency. The man replied that those words were more applicable to her. The girl laughed. Was he still sure he had a chance? And her laughter sounded crazy and loud. The man smiled, his expression as calm as ever. It seemed that nothing could make him mad. The man smiled. The villain shouldn't have confessed early. The unexpected happens just when you least expect it, when you think you'll win. The formation had completed at this moment. The spirit wondered, who could turn into a monster? Isn't everything under her control here? At this moment, something strange began to happen. Ping Ping started. A vortex of magical energy formed around her. All she said was, Xiao Kei. Her voice changed, and it was like a growl. The girl turned to her. Her eyes turned black and her pupils vertical like a beast's. The woman wondered, how was that even possible? The man smiled and watched the whole thing from the side. At this moment, a shovel was being carried at him from behind. Their main character had finally awakened. There was some anticipation in those words. The girl couldn't understand how she was able to handle her hypnosis. The energy was filling all the available space. Pin clenched her fists and gritted her teeth until they crunched. Now she was like a monster that had been pissed off to the extreme. So she had been using her all this time, and also hurt so many innocent people. The girl was furious, but it seemed her former friend was only laughing it off. She was amused by the little girl's anger. Shouldn't she want to save her begging sign just as much as these people who were hurting her? But the girl was furious. She screamed that this thing didn't deserve it. She swung her fist to hit the creature, which turned out to be a monster. The spirit grinned. Yes, the main character was just some kind of lucky guy. Who would have thought that the newfound Chu would help him complete the task? This was simply unbelievable. The man smirked and replied that there was no blind luck in his plans. 5 minutes ago, he was standing next to the girl and activated the thought connection. He ordered the girl to wake up, and she did. It was as if a man's voice spoke inside. Does she want to know the true cause of her friend's death? Let her wake up. Let her wake up and face the truth. The girl recognized her teacher's voice and began to reach for the light that filled the entire space. Of course, she wanted to know what the real reason was. It turned out that the second ability could even be used in this way. The spirit was greatly surprised. It was unexpected, but the girl was throwing opponents in different directions. She was beginning to possess some simply monstrous power. However, he took advantage of this girl's hatred and decided to stand by while she turns into a monster and kills. How heartless he is after all. The man squatted down. Watching a young lady exterminate anything and everything around her is not to his taste. He prefers to do things on his own. Besides, doesn't the ghost wonder what has more power, love or hate? The little spirit wondered what the man was talking about. There was a rumble and an explosion in the distance. The woman triumphed and was surrounded by her puppets. That's right. That's exactly the look on her face she wanted to see. In this world, there is no such thing as genuine kindness, and that even applies to Ping Ping. The girl's fist was already flying through space. The villain didn't even think of defending herself. Come on! Let her rip off her hypocritical mask of kindness. Let them release the darkness in her heart. But the man stopped her fist almost at the very last moment. Let the young lady not be so naive. The woman was surprised at what had happened. The man grasped his student and looked directly into her eyes. How would she be able to tell the difference between evil and goodness? Events were beginning to unfold quite rapidly. He moved closer to the girl's mouth, and it seemed as if they were about to come together in a passionate kiss. But that wasn't it at all. The man began to forcefully suck the dark energy from her soul. The blackness had receded from the girl's eyes. Now, consciousness began to slowly return to her head. She was no longer a monster. Finally, the girl's face transformed, and she immediately blushed with embarrassment when she saw the teacher's face so close to her own. She took hold of her cheeks, and looked with big eyes directly at the man. The woman couldn't believe it. Came back with one kiss? What the hell is this bullshit? The man turned to her and smiled, replied that he would tell her the answer to that question in the next life. There was a short, tinkling snap of fingers. The woman still didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, a small bone flew into her forehead with great speed and immediately pierced her skull. There was a loud crunch, and shards of skull and blood splattered in different directions. The woman fell to the floor with a loud thud. Now, her heart stopped beating for eternity. She would no longer be able to hurt anyone. A plaque popped up in front of the man, indicating that the task had been completed. The final calculation of the reward would be summarized upon his return to the murderous intent space. I think it was time for him to go. The space around him began to warp into another world. The girl wondered, was her teacher leaving so soon? The man looked at her with an affectionate gaze. She grasped his hand as if she didn't want to let go. The man looked at her with warmth and kindness and replied that he was only returning to where he should be. The girl asked if they would meet again. There was hope in her words. The man began to rise up. He was floating on an unknown force. Finally, he told her that if he were her, he would hope it would never happen. After a few seconds, he shot upward, leaving a trail of incomprehensible energy behind him. The girl was left all alone with her thoughts. She had to understand and realize it all. The hypnotized students started to wake up. They were lying on the floor, moaning in pain. All of them had a splitting headache. None of them could understand what had happened to them. She looked up with hope and some sadness. Master, she was so reluctant to part with him. The man was already in the C-444 killing intent space. This space was different from the normal world. There were many colors raging everywhere, old Chinese lanterns flying. It was like a spirit world. Basically, the name was. The man wondered, is this the place where the mission totals would be held? Our stronghold. The demon looked at him in surprise. Now we have to wait for him to make a decision. Give the award, assign the next task, and the accounts are done. That's right. This is a space that can only be visited by hosts who have successfully completed the task. How long ago that was, the spirit sighed heavily. Because of past Cretans, he hadn't been here in several hundred years. The man wondered, so only carriers can get in, says? That's funny. Those words made him think. Pip-Pin rubbed her eyes. She didn't realize what a strange place she was in. Everything around her was very colorful and reminded her of a cartoon. The spirit's jaw dropped in surprise. How is this possible? It's unthinkable. How did that girl get in here? A monkey's head appeared from somewhere. A thunderous voice began to speak. Originally, she herself had agreed to become their host. Today's failure must not be repeated. He flew over to the body of the defeated villain and began to scrutinize it. The girl's back began to crack, exposing muscle and bloody mess. With a crunch, a new body began to emerge from her former body, completely naked, covered in blood and slime. The girl was transformed. Now her appearance bore little resemblance to that of a human. Dear 4, the occasional mishap is what makes life so interesting. The girl grinned. After all, life without a worthy opponent is only too boring. Yulian began to transform. Her body was covered in fire. Her clothes began to tear, changing before her eyes. Her pants cracked open, exposing her supple form, and 2 transparent wings grew right above them. It was very bold. The woman smiled and noted that she couldn't help but praise his proclivities. On the other hand, the word aptitude hardly applied to a monster that lived for 1,000 years. The woman glinted her eyes and began to scrutinize the people present. She looked forward to her next meeting with her teacher. In any case, she had already agreed to become a host or whatever it was called, and now she was more like an insect. The scars he inflicted on her, she would fill with his own blood. The girl had gone from a normal student to a bee queen. All the students under his control became like zombies again. Their eyes turned red. They lost their consciousness again and turned into nothing more than a helpless swarm. Of course, we must not forget her lover. The girl jumped and flew upwards, leaving a plume of magical energy behind her. At that time, the students started beating each other. Bones were crunching. Blood was flying in different directions mixed with knocked-out teeth. A real massacre began. At this time, the boys were in a different space, a space of murderous intention. See, what's wrong with this girl? The spirit pondered. Not only had she managed to return from the monster state, but now she had also entered the killing intent state. The girl whirled her head around, trying to keep track of the spirit flying around her. Was she the original host? I don't think so. How could the original host be so clueless? The girl pushed the annoying spirit away and apologized, but couldn't he stop? She just wanted to be with the teacher, that's all. The spirit, thrown off by the powerful slap, flew aside. He grinned, no courtesy to the girl. Does she even know who she raised her hand to? The teacher looked down at her. What would her family think after her sudden disappearance? A bunch of speculations began to form in his head, the situation taking an amusing turn. He had to try to explain it all somehow. But the girl faded her gaze and replied that she was an orphan. There was so much sadness in her voice that even the man's insides twitched. He looked at her and recognized his battle buddy more and more. Now they were like two peas in a pod. Snippets of their past lives came to mind. The girl continued to tell her sad, sad story. Since she was a little girl, she had to work and study at the same time, so she never managed to make friends. She had 2 acquaintances with Yu Lian. She thought she had found a friend, but in the end, it turned against her. Little Ghost brushed away a tear. Her story was indeed regrettable, but it wasn't that simple. He shouted, "Let her go quickly back to her world. Let her not make trouble for him here. What does this have to do with us? The girl just invaded the spirit world without any warning." The girl tried to justify herself and stammered that she just wanted to follow her teacher and she didn't know how to get back. The spirit stopped and for a second was stunned. For a second the girl turned around and fear flashed across her face. She saw something scary, something that was coming at her with great speed. She saw a huge, sharp shard flying at her favorite teacher from the side. The teacher noticed it too, but he wouldn't have had time to dodge anyway. The speed was too fast. The man turned around and was horrified to see a huge spike flying at him. He put his arm out in an attempt to defend himself from the attack. Something changed. A man stood with his arms spread out, and a large green sprout like the stem of some tree was heading towards him. Everything here was very strange and looked out of place in the ordinary human world. The outgrowth came close to his forehead and began to release several more small stalks that dug into his skin. Something strange began to happen. The man's consciousness began to change. Degree of completion of the assignment. A. Reward for performance talent points. 5 distribution is made at personal discretion between the characteristics of the character. Experience points 80% to level up lacks 20%. Potential of the bearer AA. Carrier potential C. This means that the natural data is above average. Spirit believes a man can survive a visit to the worlds of 10. Not bad. Plus, he got 5 attribute points. Apparently, the chief is pleased with how the man completed the task this time. The same stem approached and she was frightened and opened her eyes with surprise. The little spirit got angry. He decided to check out this lost half. Chew? He's just kidding. His eyesight must have gotten really bad in his old age. It's a waste of energy. But then, something strange began to happen. The stem came close to the girl's head and some strange hieroglyphs began to appear, indicating the process of assessing the talents of the bearer. After that, the girl pitched backward and the man deftly picked her up. It was all unfamiliar to her. The stalk once again glowed with a strange green color. The talent evaluation was taking place. The air began to vibrate and everyone froze, waiting for the results. After seeing that, the spirit opened its mouth in astonishment. This girl had a rank a talent. This was simply unthinkable. This was the first time he had ever seen such a thing. It was unthinkable. North European neighborhood, all father in heaven. Another goddamn Titanic level? Someone's booming voice ordered that bald head to shut up at last. There were many spirits in this world. One of them looked like a dog, most likely an Egyptian god reading some manuscript. It was in a neighborhood in ancient Egypt. From behind a translucent curtain came someone's affectionate voice. They informed Anubis that a new son had been born. In Japan's neighborhood, also everyone was surprised, but it was unlikely to affect the rush demand in his store. A man of small stature was sweeping the street neatly and with a broom. He was dressed in ancient Japanese traditional clothes. In the neighborhood, a girl dressed in a witch costume slept at a table. Next to her sat an owl, which was loudly hooting a small feather in its mouth. In various parts of the world, the news spread that a new man with supernatural powers had appeared. There was excitement everywhere. Everyone wanted to see this miracle with their own eyes. The spirit grinned and flew over to the girl. "So, she's a rank A, young lady. Does she have some cherished wish that she wants to fulfill?" The spirit's rhetoric immediately changed to a more affectionate one. Would she like to consider becoming its host? Whatever her wish was, he could help fulfill it. The man irritably shoved him aside, and then the two flew backwards, tumbling through the air. How loyal he was, after all. The words were sarcastic. The girl still didn't fully understand what had happened to her. She asked her teacher if this rank meant she could stay. The man thought. His mind flashed back to memories of his lover. It was this very girl. The man looked at his student in silence. He walked over to her and stroked her head affectionately. The man said that now she could just call him by his first name. She whispered his name and immediately blushed with embarrassment. The demon flew up to them and said that since they were here, we should find them rooms to rest. He called them his dear hosts. The spirit grinned, incredibly pleased with his good fortune. The friends turned around and looked forward in surprise. Something beyond human comprehension began to happen there. The girl was startled and even a little frightened. She was not yet fully accustomed to such an unusual environment. Suddenly, her face disappeared. He grinned and said, "Well, that's a problem. A new assignment has come in. Looks like he'll be able to rest next time. Assuming they come back alive, of course." The girl looked at her teacher apprehensively. They glanced at each other. The man was serious as always. This was no news to him. The girl, on the other hand, would have to adapt a bit. Who knows how long it would take? He stroked her head once more, and coming close to her said that it looked like they would have to reschedule the inspection of their residence for next time. The girl blushed again with embarrassment. The spirit turned into a small feather and invited them to follow. The man looked away in surprise and prepared to move. Pillars of energy reappeared, and the protagonist, along with his companion, set off on a new mission. At parting, he told the girl to make sure to wait for him. Of course she would wait for him. The girl watched as her beloved teacher disappeared. Now she was left to herself, alone with her thoughts. The man's eyes opened and he found himself in some strange place. This place was not like Earth. There were incomprehensible creatures everywhere. Some looked like animals, some still had human form. Bright lights were shining everywhere. Surely they had traveled to the other dimension, and they began to look at them with interest, putting their hands to their eyes as if it could help them in any way. The man looked down, and what he saw surprised him immensely. He had a woman's breasts. The spirit grinned and wryly said that it seemed he was now a girl in this world, and a pretty good-looking one at that. Indeed, the protagonist now looked like a woman dressed in colorful clothes. Instead of legs, she had some kind of mechanical implants. With irony in her voice, the girl thanked her companion for the compliment. "She is similar." The protagonist was not fazed by the fact that he was now a girl. The transformation of energy and the lumping of matter in this world is beyond imagination. Plaques of information began to appear in front of them. Who the hell is this? The spirit was surprised. After all, they had just arrived and hadn't done anything yet. How could there be so much? Everyone looked at the newcomers with surprise. Were those rumors really true? This was the first time they had seen someone who had survived after his digital data had been destroyed by the blade of the law. Shouldn't it be a dead girl? The protagonist pondered. Based on the available information, this is now a rhyme star on which pure energy is the leading force. They looked forward in surprise. There were signs with the main character's image on them. Police Officer 9.874 is suspected of committing a crime. An invisible voice asked all citizens to be vigilant. The protagonists wondered, are they wanted? The spirit grinned. This wanted man seems to resemble the protagonist. The girl grinned. Why the uncertainty, the word a bit, was not appropriate. The surroundings continued to stare at the protagonist. Apparently, his appearance, or rather, resurrection, caused quite a stir among the average local population. The girl turned around and looked away. Something wasn't right. They were all alert, preparing for something sudden, and it did happen. Red digital columns began to appear around the girl. They shielded her from the outside world, as if creating a barrier. Something strange was happening. The protagonist had never seen anything like this before. He had never been to such worlds before. There was a crackling sound, and the digital columns began to vaporize, revealing some obscure one-eyed cyborgs. They appeared one by one. It was accompanied by some sort of electrical crackling. Soon the formation was complete, and the robots stared at the girl with their one eye. The protagonist braced himself for the fact that he would now have to fight back. The situation was escalating with every second. She pushed herself off the floor and made a big throw toward the unknown creatures. With one blow, the girl split several monster bodies with her hand. One of them's arm flew off. There was the same metallic cracking sound. The heads began to separate from the body, but immediately reattached themselves back. The girl wondered, was this the dominant pure energy? The cyborgs continued to surround her and had their arms locked in a circle, preventing her from escaping. But the main character had a katana behind his back. The little spirit laughed wryly. He won't be destroyed before he meets his partner, right? There was a lot of sarcasm in that sentence. The spirit didn't seem to believe the success of this operation. A partner? The protagonist wondered. Would he really have a partner here? At the last moment, the girl managed to dodge, and a better pure energy passed a few centimeters from her chest. The spirit was surprised. Hadn't he even looked at his assignment? A beam of pure energy hit the floor and surrendered with a metallic clang. The surrounding people, still standing motionless, bounced to the sides. They watched fearfully at what was happening. It was clear that they didn't see this kind of thing often. The girl dodged the robot's blows. The spirit grinned, right? He hadn't gotten around to showing the protagonist his ally yet. A table with a task appeared in front of the girl. System Mission 2. V. Destroy the Capitol. Destroying a target without Chu occurring will result in a rank increase. Destroying a target when 3 Chus occur 50% of experience for rank increase. Destroying a target when 10 Chus occur 10% of experience for rank increase. Destroying the target when more than 10 survival monsters appear. And failure of the task in the case of 3 completed items. Suddenly, a huge metal fist swept through the sign. Cyborg had managed to spot the girl after all, and now intended to flatten her. The girl bounced to the side, and the monster's fist slammed straight into the ground, making the same metallic digital sound. It was all so strange that she had to adapt on the fly. The girl bounced to the side. The demon chuckled and said that her reaction went nowhere. He continued to snicker. This annoyed the protagonist terribly, but it was impossible to pay attention to it now. He used the apprentice's second ability. Red threads began to crawl in different directions to learn new information. This was the boundless ocean of knowledge. The threads stopped near the cyborgs and dug into their necks. The study of the new matter began, but it didn't turn out to be that simple. The study had not begun. Could it be that the boundless ocean of knowledge only affects matter and has no effect on clots of energy? The girl watched in amazement and horror as her plan failed. The robots activated their digital blasters and pointed the barrels straight at the protagonist. A pink light flashed. She had to get out of the line of fire, or she was going to be incinerated. A look of horror flashed across her face. Judging from the experience he should have passed into this world again after the original owner of this body died. Therefore, in this world, there should definitely be a way to destroy energy. But the question is it possible? The blasters made a firing sound, and tons of energy beams flew at the protagonist. He pulled out his katana to protect himself from imminent death. A sharp swing and the energy beams split in two. Now the protagonist was relatively safe. At least he had found a way to resist these creatures. He held tightly onto his katana, which was chopping the sizzling ray of energy. The spirit rejoiced. Now that's different. Now it recognizes its host. As he approached one of the robots, he stabbed it in the eye with his sword. There was a crack of metal, and now, one less enemy. Suddenly, the blade of the sword turned purple and pink. It looked like the sword was absorbing the energy that was in that monster's body. So this katana can also be used like this. Well, that makes it easier. The cyborg fell to the ground with a loud sound, his only eye shattered. Now his mechanical consciousness had left him. The girl enthusiastically grabbed her sword and with great leaps began to make her way right into the very crowd of robots. Now, the protagonist at least knew how to fight them. He swung his sword in different directions, metal cracking. The girl chopped the cyborgs one by one. They stood there, unable to react in any way. Swinging her sword once more, she severed the mechanical arm in one blow. The movement stopped more and more quickly each time. The blows came one after another and the robots fell apart. Soon the protagonist was already standing on a pile of corpses of mechanical creatures. He was breathing heavily, holding onto his sword. The deed was done, but he still kept his guard up, laughing. Not even the robots are able to stop him? The girl sighed and told him not to be so naive. It is impossible to control the tranquility of the entire city, relying only on robots of this level. Therefore, destroying them in the end would attract stronger pursuers to him. Still need to stay alert. Until they fully understand the situation, there's no need to get involved. He hopes his so-called partner will be capable. Suddenly, a beam of green energy cut through the sky. It smashed into the ground with a thunderous crash, and the protagonist barely had time to bounce aside before he was vaporized by it. A muscular man emerged from the beam. He stood in a heroic pose as if he were showing off for himself. He held a pink fan in his hand. He began to mutter something to himself. "I'm here to save my little sister. Save her, Lou." The spirit laughed. It had been a long time since he had encountered other systems. The protagonist just looked at the pile of flaming robots that were instantly melted by that beam of energy. Why did these mechanisms take material form after his attack? Are these the abilities of his rank? A man extended his hand to him and introduced himself. His name was Li Fei Hong, a noble husband. He said his title was Confucian. He smiled broadly and clearly was pleased to meet him. They shook hands and looked into each other's eyes. The man tried to be as good-natured and friendly as possible. Confucian? The spirit was surprised. Truly the title matched the content. The gathering of the blue team was concluded at this point. The protagonist asked, "How long does the rank exist in principle?" The spirit said that, although he knew it, he didn't really want to give out that kind of information to her right now. Not if he was asked nicely. He never missed an opportunity to mock, as always. Suddenly, a second spirit similar to him appeared and said that, as far as he knew, there were 12 kinds of ranks. He jumped into his master's arms and the latter stroked him affectionately. The protagonist didn't miss the opportunity to pat the affectionate spirit on the head either. That's right. It looks like he should think about changing his system too. The spirit took offense. Isn't he the one who keeps saying it's unseemly to change the feeder right in front of his partner? The man asked, what does he thinks it's a feeder change, and the protagonist thinks it's an exaggeration. The spirit asked, what is her rank? The girl put her finger to her lips and said it was a secret. The spirit was angry. When she was treated with kindness and trust, one should be noble. Besides, by recognizing each other's abilities, it's possible to achieve better cooperation with one's partner. A little yielding, and a noble husband should always be. But the man didn't have time to finish, for the spirit interrupted him and said in a firm voice that she was a man. This was very unexpected news. Lee came to be horrified by this. His eyes widened and his jaw dropped. Could this really be possible? The man didn't know what to say. He began to choke, unable to say a word. His eyes widened and snot came out of his nose. He closed himself off from the protagonist with his fan and started muttering to himself, which, to be honest, he always wanted to. The girl looked at him with a surprised look. It looked like it was starting to dawn on her. The protagonist looked at his new partner with a studied look. He wasn't annoyed by him, but I wasn't particularly sympathetic either. He turned away and said, suggesting that he run as fast as possible. The man finally came to his senses and looked at the protagonist back in surprise. Indeed, they had to get away as quickly as possible, as the protagonists were already being followed by several police drones that were tracking them. After all, they were wanted in this world. Lee stopped talking and looked up. The drone was already looking down at him, leaving his machine guns behind. Suddenly, she did not come in a burst of masculine strength, and he shouted in a noble voice that a true noble husband must protect a handsome man, that is, a friend. The drones, they were approaching them at a rapid speed. These flying machines were already a whole swarm. He clenched his fist and tried to convey to himself a fighting spirit. A true noble husband should not run from a challenge. But now it seemed that the man was in a less belligerent mood. Now, two large rocks appeared in front of him, similar to the ones that surrounded the protagonist in the beginning. They began to deform, taking on human-like shapes. Following that, they deformed into the shape of huge robots. They were simply enormous in size, and the man looked at them with horror. This was definitely something he couldn't handle on his own. These monsters looked quite formidable. The man immediately changed his mind. He looked at his new opponents in surprise and fear. Should a true noble husband listen to other people's opinions? He turned to the protagonist, but he was already running away from the battlefield. He immediately caught up with the girl and asked why his partner didn't call him out. What are they doing next? Strange scraps of memory began to appear in the girl's mind. It seemed to be the memories of the previous owner of this body. The two of them ran away from the huge robots that began to chase them. The earth trembled beneath their feet, and monstrous explosions rang out behind them. Several girls were sitting tied up, surrounded by several masked bandits. One of them said she found the blue group. The girl in blue clothes was called Xiao Nian, a poor woman who was tied up with her mouth taped Xiao Hua. Xiao Nian herself. The rest. Let her provide the rest. The gathering of the red team was complete at this point. Another man dressed in short shorts and a tank top came into the room. Then he quickly told the girls to follow him. He had bright green hair and was holding a heavy club. He said they'd had a lot of luck. Just got here and got a chance to see the boss. Not everyone gets that. They walked up the steps, climbing higher and higher. The girls walked behind them, following their companion. They were held hostage to a very bad situation. Soon they came to another door. The man went inside and addressed the boss, saying that he had brought someone. They entered the room, and they saw there a multitude of bizarre beasts. There were dogs, lizards, and some human-like creatures. On a chair lay a fat man, wearing a cap, smoking a cigar, filling the room with the odor of acrid smoke. The air in the room was heavy. The man took a cigar out of his mouth and told the others to come forward. His voice was disgusting, and so was his appearance. The girls were again surrounded by several strange creatures. All of them began to laugh and stare at the defenseless captives with predatory eyes. The man rose from his chair and came closer to them. Now, up close, he looked even more enormous. The girls looked up at him, their knees shaking at the sight of him. The man grinned, stretching his fat mouth into a smile. He held out his large hand to them, which had a black manicure on it. It pleased him. The quality of this product is very good. With one hand, he picked up one of the girls and began to lift her up. He was so huge that the girl fit almost completely in his hand. Her mouth stretched into a smirk at this assignment. She'd be so lucky. Things were going as best as her plan could. A strange blue-colored energy blob appeared in front of the man. First ability: anger comprehension. Ability description: the ability to perform attacks with 1,000% amplification. The man didn't realize what was happening. He only stared at it in surprise with his eyes hidden behind his purple glasses. What a boy. He liked it a lot. Suddenly there was a bright flash and they found themselves in a completely different place. Was it teleportation? The man began to mimic the girl, repeating her name. Now they were upside down. It would be very difficult to hold on. Were you shocked at what just happened? A look of horror flashed across the heroine's face. How is this even possible? Is this fatty really the perfect host? The two girls found themselves right under the high ceiling. It would be very hard to stay up there. The man was looking down at them and smirking. Neon couldn't believe it. No, it wasn't like that. He had made an exchange of energy units. Life forms in the electronic world exist in an energetic state. Based on various emotional changes, they are able to create energy of the appropriate type. The collected energy can be applied for various purposes. However, the collection and application of this energy is in the hands of the capital, the computer network of this world. By implementing this method, he has essentially seized control of all of society. Society, depending on the preferences and sympathies of that bastard, was divided into classes. Each of the people was finely controlled. Ordinary citizens able to use 30 units of energy annually. Fighters and officials use over 100 and sometimes over 1,000 units of energy every day. Finally, the top-level officials and confidants of the most important. They are capable of using more than 1,000 units of energy every day. Capet raised his fat head and looked up. It was dangerous. Thus, a huge difference was created between people of different classes. This monster's energy was as much as 3. Spatial transference had been accomplished. Although it was possible for people to accumulate more energy and rise to a higher level of the social hierarchy, few people had actually succeeded fully. The chief ordered everyone to draw their weapons and grab them. His henchmen nodded their heads in agreement and pulled the bolts of their guns. The girl jumped down from the top and prepared to land downward with her whole body grouped together. According to the memories of the previous owner, Capet is the person who possesses the most energy in this world. With their 30 units of energy, fighting him in the open is not possible. The only possibility was to utilize the rank abilities with which they had been endowed by the murderous intent system. Except the ability they were given was limited by their mental state. Right now, her limit of use is 2 minutes. The girl concentrated all of her digital energy and applied the second ability of the Akal. As soon as she did so, a dome of protection appeared around her. In the ability description, endows the wielder with absolute protection. The duration depends on the strength of the attacks the wielder is subjected to, as well as his mental state. The girl braced herself and prepared to take the blow. She realized that there was no escape from this place. Even so, this world is made up entirely of energy life forms, quite ordinary. At this point, it would have to be determined if her abilities could do damage to these people. The girl landed on the ground, and the blast wave from her landing threw several people back. The colors blended together, forming some sort of strange vortex. In this vortex, it was unclear who was where. Energy waves spread out, filling all available space. The man grinned and spat on the ground. Not bad, but still wasted. Or had they already forgotten the difference in the amount of energy between them? He used the minigun in his hands. He shouted for them to finally die. A burst of gunfire erupted. Millions of fiery bullets flew straight at the girl. Seconds more and they would just tear her apart. What an idiot! Hasn't he realized yet that her ability doesn't depend on their energy points and that those are completely different things? She concentrated all the digital energy she had into herself. After using anger comprehension, the first ability, a huge statue of an ancient god appeared behind her. Capip marveled he had never seen this before. Wasn't that an exchange per unit of energy? What in the world was this anyway? The man looked up from the bottom of his head fearfully. The girl's face stretched into a predatory smile. Well, this one is in the next life. He was poking haphazardly at the screen, trying to use all units of energy for spatial transfer. He had to get out of here as soon as possible or he'd be flattened. There's something wrong with this little one. We need to get word to Capit right away. But then, something went wrong. Space began to change. The protective dome that had been formed began to gradually break apart. The man couldn't move. It all seemed like some kind of nightmare to him. This simply couldn't be real. The huge bayonet was already flying straight at him, and in a few seconds it would flatten the fat man. The man stood there, unable to move, and just watched his approaching death. It just couldn't be. He couldn't believe what was happening. Death was in his eyes, but there was nothing he could do. There was a thud. The man's body was covered in energy, and it began to eat him from the inside out, tearing the flesh, releasing it outward. The temperature was monstrous. The body began to disintegrate right in front of his eyes. After a few seconds, all that was left of the man's body were clots. His clothes fell to the floor, covered in digital blood. The girl landed a little farther away. It turns out her ability can deal damage to them after all. That's funny. But now, her body was almost completely exhausted. She twitched, almost falling to the floor. Her friend supported the girl in time. Nyan squinted her eyes in pain. Units of energy from just one second-grade boss was already enough to completely use up her mental strength. If now they were to meet the target of the task, its chances of success would be minuscule. In addition, there is still the obstacle of their rivals. It was time to focus on something else. But something strange began to happen. The protective dome broke apart, and from there, two figures emerged and swiftly fell downwards. It was Lee, along with the main character. They burst into the room like a whirlwind breaking through a wall. The man smiled and asked his friend if they were running away. Why was it necessary to break the wall? The girl looked at the mess he had made, and at the fact that there were two other girls standing among the piles of stones, looking fearfully in her direction. At this place, only Zhao Jianxun is able to use more than 1,000 points of energy. But judging from the traces at the scene, there were two groups of people here who are able to use more than 1,000 units. Does he have a clue about everything? They looked at the strange aliens in surprise. Were these their competitors? The guys stood in front of them in full battle readiness. It's not a good time to meet them. For a while, she wouldn't be able to use her abilities. A spirit in the form of an ancient fish also appeared near the girl. The girls glanced fearfully amongst themselves. If those two decided to attack, she definitely couldn't do it alone. The situation was getting hotter by the second. The main character looked straight at the unfamiliar girls. They seemed to be the rivals in this building. He doesn't know what happened here, but it looks like they went through a heated battle recently. The girl took out her cybernetic ball and prepared to attack. As long as these two are weakened, it's worth taking advantage of this opportunity. The spirit laughed. He wants to take advantage of their weakness? How cruel. Well, we should get down to business soon. But suddenly, the girl was illuminated by a spotlight. A drone began to fly above her, and two police robots appeared out of nowhere. An invisible voice told her to surrender. The girl raised her hands. She had no choice but to accept their terms. The invisible voice continued to speak. Police Officer 9.874 has successfully completed the mission. The criminal Zhao conducting illegal activities on the darknet has been successfully found. Charges, human trafficking, and committing violent acts. The suspect resisted, so he was eliminated. As for the evidence, they can check his residual data, and now He needs to apply for a cease and desist order to arrest this man. The protagonist continued to keep his hands raised up. Cyborg scanned him with his eye. The report had been received. He pointed his hand at the perpetrator and began collecting residual data. Well, we had to stabilize it for final analysis. Lee wondered what was going on here. How was he able to lift the warrant for his arrest? The protagonist replied that the order for his arrest came in view of the fact that his mission was undercover. They thought he was a police traitor. The man couldn't understand, but how did he know? The main character lowered his eyes and pondered. It was most likely due to the memories of the previous owner. Nanny took her friend under her arm and led the way out of here. They needed to leave. At last, the girl cast an incredulous glance at the protagonist. Suddenly, another man emerged from the violet beam of digital energy. He came down on something that looked like a jetpack, or more likely it was a hologram. The man laughed. He wondered what was going on here. They made such a mess. The man smiled. In the end, it turned out to be a big fish for all of them. You could see from the man's face that he was very pleased. The cybernetic policeman saluted Mr. Capet. Everyone turned directly to the man. So he's the target of the mission. A man walked up to the protagonist and put his hand on his shoulder. He proudly said that if there was hard evidence against this criminal, he would be the hero of this city. After that, he came even closer, however. Since it was too sudden, they still have a lot to check and confirm. So, first of all, he asks the chief to escort the employee 9.874 so that he will be in action in the investigation. Therefore, the man's face distorted in a snide smile. Therefore, with honors, we'll have to wait. The protagonist glanced salivating and said that there was nothing to be done. Work duties first and foremost. The protagonist pointed out his companion. For the sake of the assignment, he had unilaterally recruited the man as an informant, so his name is now off the registry. Since this is the case, the capital asked 2 policemen to take the 2 victims and this diligent citizen to the police station and take them into protective custody. The man turned to the protagonist and cast an incredulous look at him. Before his death, the perpetrator sent him a message, but it didn't get through completely. The people at the scene don't inspire his trust, so there's definitely something wrong with them. He settled back in his chair and headed back out on the energy beam. Whatever it was time to take control. The protagonist sat in the police station and pondered. It was bright and cool. The atmosphere was slightly tense. Something was definitely wrong. He sat at the table and waited. Why hadn't anyone come to ask him yet? Suddenly, the door swung open noisily, and Lee flew into the room. He cursed hard and collapsed to the floor. It was as if someone had literally thrown him in here. The protagonist immediately ran up to him and began to ask him what had happened to him. The man cleared his throat and said they had a problem. Those 2 brats set them up. Heavy footsteps sounded, someone approaching them quickly. It was a man's voice, a more familiar voice. Thanks to these 2 young ladies, he recognized everything after all. It was a capital. He walked into the room, and there were these 2 women next to them. He repeated. Thanks to these girls, he found out that they were in cahoots with the perpetrator, so they should be sent to DreamWorks for re-education. The main character opened his eyes in astonishment. How is this even possible? He couldn't understand what was wrong with these girls after all. Both girls had energy points at 5. That's something that's not available to ordinary citizens. So that's how it is. The girl turned around to them and looked at them with a sarcastic gaze. The spirit laughed along with her. The competitors had screwed them over in the end. Soon, they arrived at the bus that was to take them away instead of correcting them. They were accompanied by a convoy of armed police officers who watched their every move. Lee was furious. He asked the protagonist if he had any plan. The friends had shackled hands, so it was impossible to break free. The girl turned her head to him and said that in 3 seconds we should be breaking for 9. She began a slow countdown. One of the police officers escorting them was already entering the bus. The man smiled as if tasting another fun fight. He crossed his arms over his chest out of the grouping. Eventually, the sturdy handcuffs proved not to be as sturdy, and the man tore them in half in one swift motion. Now he was free. The protagonist did the same. The chains broke with a snap. Still, they scattered in different directions once, scattering the policemen one by one. They were very weak, so they posed no danger to the protagonists. The police immediately sounded the alarm. We had to stop those two from escaping. The siren blared, and now they were sure to be chased. Suddenly, the protagonists stopped as if they had been stumped. Someone very vaguely familiar appeared in front of them, shocking them. In front of them stood one of the very girls they had just rescued, but she had set them up. The girl stood looking down at them. A little farther away, leaning on a piece of iron, stood her friend. Their faces looked vaguely familiar. The man smirked. What news? Right between the hammer and the anvil. The protagonist wondered, and why is she here? He began to scrutinize the girl. Her face seemed very familiar after all. Lee began to transform before his eyes. His strength grew exponentially. His clothes ripped off, revealing titanic muscles. But now everyone will taste his strength. The spirit couldn't stop wondering. Ping Air? How did she get out of the killing, intense space? The protagonist turned around to him, not believing his ears. Was it exactly her? The girl quickly stopped her companion, who had already rolled up his sleeves and was running to smash everyone's faces in. The girl grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him back sharply. Well, now they were completely surrounded by police officers. They stood on the perimeter, preventing them from advancing, pointing their machine guns at them, their jackets on. Lee was freaking out. He didn't understand. Why was he stopped? Fucking hell, this is it. Ping Ping said she's going to take care of these offenders herself now, and the cops are free to go. The policeman thought to object to something. The fighting ability of these two was beyond their expectations. Caution had to be paramount. The girl rested her head and looked at him with a stern look. So what he means to say is that their fighting ability is higher than hers. That's not what they meant. Then the girl ordered them to get out of sight in a harsh tone of voice. The policeman saluted and immediately fled in an unknown direction. She just took the rest of them. Looks like dealing with this lady isn't going to be that easy. Lee was already preparing himself for the possibility that he would have to fight again. He watched carefully as the cops got on their motorcycles and rode back. The man looked at his companion and wanted to say something but stopped short. The girl threw herself at the protagonist and started hugging her. She seemed to recognize her teacher from her past life. Lee was just horrified by what he saw. He didn't know where to put himself from embarrassment. The girls began to look at each other. Lee swallowed his tongue in shock. He didn't know what to think, asked. And the girl how she recognized him? The girl flooded him with questions. How come he turned into a girl? Good thing she sensed the murderous intent system right away. The girl blushed again. She didn't know how it happened, but as soon as she saw it, she felt her teacher. Her cheeks flushed again. She looked the protagonist straight in the eye and asked, "Could this be a soulmate?" At this time, the little demon companion was getting to him. "I've seen this kind of kinship in the grave. How did she even end up here?" The demon was furious. He demanded an explanation immediately. She thought about it. Explaining all of this was quite difficult, especially in a way that her words didn't show insanity. In the end, the best thing that came to her mind was to say that she herself didn't fully understand how it happened. The girl was smiling innocently, and that ruined all suspicions. The demon opened the information panel in front of him. He grinned and said that this is exactly the right girl. And don't let the main character look at him. He's confused too. The protagonist asked, "Is he sure it's definitely the right one? What's going on in the end?" Lee walked up to the new acquaintance and shook her hand. The man introduced himself good-naturedly. The girl also smiled back and said that she was very happy to meet him. The protagonist at that moment just looked at them with an annoyed look. She looked at her teacher. She was anxious about something and had a lot of questions in her head that she really wanted to ask her teacher. Approaching the protagonist, she said that they have very little time now. She will ask right away. This time the quest has something to do with the capital. For a second there was an awkward pause between them. The protagonist said he had something to ask her too, by the way. The man wondered if they had gotten into character so quickly. At this time, they were already under surveillance. Capet watched in silence then, as her subordinate betrayed him. The man gritted his teeth in anger. Standing next to him were the same two girls who had ratted out the protagonist. They asked if they should have just let them go like that. The man gave them an angry look. Turning to them, he spread his hands. The man replied that everyone should be given a chance to improve. That's the reason DreamWorks exists. But the girl was very dissatisfied with this decision. She objected that these people were very dangerous. What a contagion! She thought that he would be able to destroy the competitors with Capeta's hands, so as not to get dirty. But as he apparently decided not to do that, he would have to change his approach to the situation. He interrupted her. The man said, "Let her do her work better. Since she offered to replace this scum, she should prove to him that she can do the job." The girl was about to object to something, but her friend stopped her and said that they would surely quite manage and never fail. "Well, if he had no more to do with these wires," the girl said, "they would remove themselves and not occupy his time." The man looked at them with a commanding gaze. As they left, the girls cast an angry glance at the room in charge. They were annoyed at this state of affairs. Things were not going according to their plan. They had to change the way they approached the situation in order to achieve their goal. The two of them glanced amongst themselves now, acting differently. The girls launched a command channel. The fish began moving at double speed, creating an energy rift in space. Command mode allows team members to communicate without fear of being bugged. The girls were walking down the corridor and talking amongst themselves. Nyan said that she had planned to finish off their rivals with the capital's hands, but in the end, it didn't turn out that way. And then, it would be possible to not take his life. But that plan had failed. Her friend, looked at her sadly. She answered her without words. Besides, judging from the energy distribution privileges they had from the criminal, gathering energy that would surpass the amount possessed by the most important thing to kill him is also not possible. Her friend smirked. Then they only have one single path left. She turned to her friend and began to speak in a conspiratorial tone. Then we should use her ability to turn the rest of the monsters and let them deal with the capital themselves. First ability, animism, ability description, gives the ability to perceive and influence the target's life states. The girl walked over to one of the uniformed men and pressed one of the keys on the electronic panel. It said that the transformation into a monster was 50% complete. The main characters were sitting in the police station, and there were several dozen other people there with them. Each of them was unhappy about being detained. It was wrong for Capet to single-handedly handle an issue like energy distribution. But no one paid any attention to them. They were just prisoners, and the guard didn't even look in their direction, only silently patrolling his post. Lee turned to the protagonist. The man asked what his connection was with that girl. Why did she give him 5,000 units of energy? And why didn't she give it to him? Is she a host system too? Why was she able to leave the main deity space on her own? Does she have a boyfriend? The questions were pouring in. The protagonist replied that he himself was completely unaware of the answers to all of these questions, and before thinking about it, they should focus entirely on the current task at hand. What do they know at the moment? His companion began to curl his fingers. First, energy is the leading force of this world. Second, Capet, the main target of the quest, holds the ultimate power in the use of energy. And third, their rivals are two children whose abilities are unknown to them, for now. On second thought, that's the way it is. Combining all the first 2 points he said, it can be concluded that given the laws of this world, and I win by conventional methods, and the man started playing with his biceps and asked cockily, "Do you need rank abilities for that?" The protagonist held his head. The crux of the problem is that his two abilities are for the material world. As for his ability, if he's not mistaken, they should have a time limit. This time the man hesitated. It was right. If you hit it at full force, about a minute and a half. If you activate it for 2 or more minutes, your head would be a pain in the ass. So he's confident that in about a minute he can capture Capita while ignoring their opponents. It was as if the protagonist had thought of something. The man replied that if he could find the enemy's weak point, anything is possible. The man scratched his head and asked, "He's not joking, is he serious?" The man scratched his head and asked, "He's not joking, is he?" He couldn't believe it himself, so much so that the plan was a monster. His eyes widened in surprise and a lump caught in his throat. The girl smiled and said that the only method left was to take away the supreme power in energy distribution. A crazy smile stretched across her face. The man seemed upset. He lost his head. So she's talking about the energy control loophole left by the superintendent who told the young lady. He divided that loophole among 4 subordinates. How are they going to find this loophole? The man himself could hardly believe in the success of this plan. At that moment, the bus arrived at its destination and stopped abruptly. The protagonist replied that he already had a rough idea. First things first, we have to try our luck here. One of the 4 loopholes. The bus pulled up to a gate with a big red cross painted on it. It was like some kind of circus. At the gate, they were greeted by someone's smiling head. It was an animatronic. A man in a purple suit watched all the arrivals. He looked at the prisoners with pleasure and anticipation. They had finally arrived, his new fans' exclamation points. The girl looked directly into the camera. Her gaze was hard and cold. Soon they would be the new members of his family. The man watched them all intently and couldn't wait to play with them. Lee was furious. He absolutely hated being here. He asked the girl, how would they find a so-called loophole in such a huge amusement park? He crunched his fists and suggested that maybe they should grab someone and ask them a good question. The man was clearly suggesting that he should beat someone to a pulp. It was the only method he used. He looked in the direction where the other prisoners were going. It was a large tent with a girl standing at the entrance and calling out to everyone. All new arrivals should take part in a welcome meeting with Mr. and Lee shook his head. This seemed crazy to him. Why was it so easy? You don't even need a plan. The girls beckoned everyone inside. They welcomed the new fans. With loud ringing voices, they shouted that in the future they would become one big family. The main character ordered 2 tickets. The man was surprised and called out to him. Maybe it would be worth weighing things up again. He would look for some other way after all. The man pointed his finger backward, suggesting that he didn't want to linger here. But suddenly, he saw something that made him change his mind. The 2 summoners caught one of the people trying to escape and immediately burned him on the spot. Brother is so persistent. How can he refuse? The man was yelling that he didn't want to become some kind of fan. But it seems like he had no choice. Either you become a fan or you die. The man watched in horror. He watched as everything here was pretend and fun. The 2 girls continued to call out to all the fans, as if nothing had ever happened here. A man in a long blue raincoat had already started to enter the room. Now the sight seemed horrifying to the poor man. A chill ran down his back. How could this be? How were they going to get out of here now? It looked like he'd better not resist if he wanted to live. Laughing nervously, the man walked closer to the entrance and cautiously began to enter. He was greeted by the inviting girls. He walked up to his comrade and asked him what his plan really was in the end. The protagonist gave him an annoyed look. He was already in his seat watching the show. Was he just going to keep everything from him? The man couldn't wait to hear what they were going to do next. After all, they were in some strange, dangerous place. They couldn't leave it like this. The protagonist replied that when he saw the man's abilities in action, he had one little idea that might help them. It was quite an interesting idea. But first, it was better to see what tricks they had prepared for them. They sat down on the chair and looked at the stage, where one of the presenters had already appeared. Lee looked at his companion in surprise. His words were not encouraging at all. It was all this music that started blaring, and some yellowish mist started oozing out from under the stage. The hostess happily announced that Mr. and it's all for them. A girl jumped on the stage and waved her arms happily. A screen appeared showing a bald man dressed in a festive uniform. The protagonist didn't realize what the hell it was. Suddenly, it was as if his body was restrained. Now, he wouldn't be able to move. His arms and legs were restrained. His gaze ran around the chairs, looking for an escape. The other people were also chained to their chairs and started screaming in pain. No one expected this. Everyone was afraid. It was as if they had been electrocuted. The hall was filled with heartbreaking screams. The man whose face appeared on the stage took out a piece of paper and began to read from it. The girl didn't stop and continued to scream merrily. The protagonist sat there trying to cope with the unspeakable pain. Is this really it? People screamed in pain, but then on the stage appeared a portrait of Mr. and he was a man with purple hair and the same purple glasses. He had a huge, lush bow on his chest. People exhaled and stared straight at the stage. All this time, they were still being electrocuted. Now they began to shout that annoying slogan, "This is an experiment in Milgram subjugation." Now their minds are completely clouded. Humans have turned into will-less animals. This man is using a method of controlling the fans and turning them into his power. The Milgram obedience experiment. An experiment designed to test the power of resisting orders from a superior who goes against the conscience and beliefs of the subjects. This test is considered a canonical experiment concerning the aspect of obedience in the scientific community of social psychology. The Milgram experiment has created a strong resonance. Now, people have been turned into gutless logs. Tears flowed from their eyes and they all started chanting the same slogan. The protagonist drew his sword and in one fell swoop he broke the shackles that bound his body. Well, now he was free. In order to achieve the desired effect more quickly, they even used intoxicating gas. He could smell a strange odor that filled almost the entire space. To their annoyance, having spent his career as a field agent, he had long ago developed a resistance to suggestion. The girl shifted her gaze to her companion, let him just wait for her. The man struggled to break free. His body creaked with tension. The man rolled his eyes from overexertion and said, "The way of the warrior. The way of the warrior is everything. He is a member of the Lee clan's martial arts palace." The main character looked at him in surprise. This guy is fighting relying on pure willpower alone? Amazing, but contrary to that, his resistance can be easily exploited by Mr. and he opened the plaque with the information. So, it's pretty hard to tell what will happen to him next and whether he'll turn out to be his comrade again. Pulled a powerful tranquilizer out of the inventory. She already wanted to put her companion to sleep lest he should succumb to the stupefying influence finally. But from somewhere came the soft voice of Mr. And. He said it was all useless. The man's hologram came closer and repeated, for he had already become part of his family. The girl looked in surprise at the man approaching her. It was the man who was the culprit of the celebration. Li Fei Hong was finally able to break the shackles restraining his body and roared like a beast. The protagonist flew aside, followed by the syringe. He tried to enlighten his comrade and said that the main villain was right behind him. The girl threw her sword right at Mr. and it hit right in the bull's eye. There was a crunch, and blood spurted from his head. But it wasn't over yet. The girl barely had time to slow down, for the man's punch was incredibly strong. Lee was furious. Looks like he had been influenced after all. A comrade now, turned into a rival. The man lunged straight at him and held out his huge, massive fist. His eyes turned white. He was definitely hypnotized. Now I wonder how to get him out of that stupefying state. He tried his best to fend off the man's attacks. Apparently, he has fallen into the abyss of his own memories and considers the protagonist his enemy. He dodged Lee's punch and tried to throw him over his back. The man couldn't stay on his feet and fell on his side. The protagonist was literally fighting with his last strength. They scattered in different directions. Physical strength was at its limit. Wu Ji, now his only option is to use even more units of energy to exchange for stronger weapons, only that under such circumstances he can't vouch that he won't hurt him. Devil! If he had eliminated that man with a recent blow, then everything would be fine. Li was standing a little behind, and a monstrous aura was emanating from him. Liquidated? That's just the thing about family members. It wasn't that simple. Out of the corpse of a recently murdered man came a hologram of Mr. End. The protagonist wondered, this type of what can inhabit others? The spirit laughed. It wasn't quite right. The man's chest was pierced again by something sharp like a knife. He smiled. Turns out it didn't hurt him at all. How long would it take him to, So the man killed a member of his so-called family. He pulled out a bloody knife and licked drops of blood off the blade. It was a real monster. The main character, along with his spirit, looked at the man carefully. His ability of this type was too strange. The spirit said that he saw his spirit shell just moved from that person's body to another person's body. But they still had one more problem. The protagonist's ally still hadn't come to his senses. He lunged at the girl with his fists. She thinks you still have time to think. Better get ready to become the new member of the family. Wu Ji didn't have time to dodge and caught a powerful blow to his jaw. His body flew up high, his head spinning, his thoughts confused. The impact was simply monstrous. Li wasn't going to stop. He jumped after the girl, intending to kill her now. The protagonist tried with all his might to get rid of the old one. It wasn't good. If it continued like this, he might as well die. It was simply impossible to fight several opponents at the same time. And then he missed the punch again. His fist came right into his stomach. His breath hitched and blood spurted from his mouth, and the man was incredibly strong. And then, the final blow. The body flew straight into the ground and crashed with such force that cracks crawled across the floor. One more second, and he would be finished. It couldn't go on like this, and landed with him nearby. His gait was soft. A man leaned over the lifeless body of the protagonist. The girl was unconscious. Smoke was coming from her. The impact was unbelievable. How do you deal with it? Mr. Yi jumped up to him like a bird and gave him his hand. Well, welcome to the new member of the family. He was incredibly happy to have a new toy. The man yanked the girl's breathless body toward him. Now she was completely in his hands. But he seemed to be early to rejoice. The girl waited a moment and grabbed his arm. The grip was dead. The man wondered, was she all right after such a blow? Wu Ji held his hand tightly and called out to his comrade, "This person has returned to normal? How is this possible? What did she do?" But then, a spirit appeared. He started to explain. The truth was right in front of him, but he couldn't see it, that's all. The man was confused. All his plans were falling apart before his eyes. Fai Hong had already gained full strength. His body was completely covered in magical fire energy. The man had finally come to his senses and was now furious. He dared to force a noble husband to harm his own comrade. This was simply not a permissible act. The head of the family laughed. Even if they killed him, he would just pass into another body and immediately be reborn. The girl jumped up and asked, "Who said they were going to kill him?" The man looked at her in surprise. What was she up to after all? Many red threads appeared from somewhere and began to entangle the entire space. Alignment, the first skill of a disciple, a boundless ocean of knowledge. The man didn't understand anything at all. What kind of incredible force was this? Who were they? The girl fixed her hair and said dreamily that they were just ordinary passers-by. You could hear the mockery in her voice. And now, the man will tell him the secret of the Captain Loophole. The huge ship was already speeding toward the man. Second ability, mental link. The man looked at it all with an uncomprehending stare. He opened his mouth in surprise. For now, his life could be cut short. The girl was sitting right on top of this ship made of energy and was heading straight for him at breakneck speed. A strange illusion covered the entire space. The people transformed and turned around in surprise to look at him. It was memories. There were many moments from his past life swirling in his memory. The protagonist plunged completely into his memory. He saw Capet standing in front of the boy and holding him by his shoulders. The boy was very scared. A horrifying scene unfolded before him. Several robotic arms were pulling out a man's eye. He was wrapped in bandages and lying on some sort of couch. It looked like an operating table. Eventually, the man assumed his true form, which he was now in. This is Mr. Lee's origin, so where's the loophole? The main character also saw Mr. becoming exactly who he was now. He finally found it. Mr. Lee presented his two eyes in front of him. Originally, it was his loophole. He saw how Mr. Lee presents his two eyes in front of the Supreme Capet. Fei Hong, finally coming to his senses, called out to his friend. At this moment, the protagonist was on this ghostly ship that was drifting through memories. It's finally over. Back to her original position. Lee looked at her with a concerned look and in a trembling voice asked how it had gone. She's eyes. Now his loophole is in their hands. Everything went just fine. A smile stretched across the girl's face. Fei Hong started jumping with happiness. They had finally succeeded. The power with which he had used to invade his mind. The girl looked at the defeated enemy. He didn't know where to put himself anymore. The man felt defeated. This force is not from this world, and their essence is not from this world either. The man seemed to be beginning to figure it all out. Now, everyone could see his empty eye sockets. Li Fei Hong closed his mouth in surprise and fear. The good guy didn't say anything right now. The man smiled. No need to hide anything. During the control, he managed to see some memories. It turned out that there was a world in the universe that was dominated by material form. This was truly excellent. The girl asked in a serious voice, and what of all this had he learned? A dead man would be unlikely to reveal their secret. She brought her sword to the man's throat. He was already on his knees and seemed to be in no danger. He smiled and said she couldn't kill him. The man's face began to deform, and he shouted that he would be by his master's side forever. Smoke came out of his mouth. His face began to deform into a monstrous smile. Now his body was covered in digital energy. It was simply evaporating. Li Fei Hong completely lost his ability to think. He didn't realize what was wrong with him. What had his brother done to him? The girl turned around to him and answered, "No, his energy is disappearing on its own. Is it like one of his self-destructs?" The man's body began to disintegrate into atoms, and they took the loophole that was here's purpose was to seize the right to control the highest level of energy. Watching all his efforts to be here, the man would tell them one very interesting thing had come to a safe conclusion. There was a resounding laugh. It turns out that their efforts had turned the man into pure energy. Now, that energy belongs to Capet-san. The face gradually began to disintegrate into thin air. It left behind only a bare skeleton. Soon, there was nothing left of the man at all, just a handful of ashes from his self-destruction. For a second, there was a pause between them. No one dared to say a word. Everyone was stunned by this outcome. Fei Hong didn't understand anything. What did his words mean? They had won, but why did it feel like he was wrong? The man finally stopped understanding anything. The girl shook her head. She didn't understand anything herself, but they should run away from here faster since Capita had implanted a self-destruct program in Mr. Lee. News should have come to him by now. Before being caught, at the very least they must master another energy point. The man's white finger dipped to the transparent screen. He pressed something there. Capet stood in front of the screen and watched carefully. Next to him stood Police Chief Ping Pong. The man was furious. He grabbed his head. It was starting to splinter with a multitude of thoughts. Everything was not going according to plan, and it pissed him off incredibly. The girl was concerned and asked if the gentleman was all right. The man only raised his hand in the air to show that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. Then he turned to the girl and said in a calm voice that Mr. Lee's loophole had been captured. He said it without sadness. There was a smile on his face for some reason. The man tried to keep his composure. The girl began to play surprised. How so? Who dared? Who would be capable of such a thing? How did they know the loopholes existed? But inside, the girl was cheering. Her master was really cool. But then, an already terrible guess visited her. Her eyes widened in surprise. No, how did Capita know what had happened to this man, since he hadn't left this place? Besides, his loophole had been taken away, but you could tell by the look in his eyes that he wasn't very upset. The man noticed this and asked. She hesitated, seeing him smile, knowing he had a loophole stolen from him. A subordinate has no right. The girl began to ramble. The man turned to the screen and began to show a video of a ship approaching them. This is the video Mr. Lee sent him before he died. She should watch it too. The girl looked on in surprise. Is this all energy? That's it. The end. She really didn't know that such a video could appear. Now his teacher had added more problems. The man shook his head. No, this energy was not the energy of their world. He glanced at the girl. She continued to play up the surprise. Perhaps she really was surprised by such news. The man waved his hand. The day the main criminal died, 9.874, that the guy traveling with him is an informant. He looked at all the records of their energy transaction and the number of vibrations, but he couldn't see the energy crossing over. The man hesitated again. Moreover, while checking their information, he noticed that 9.874 because of the investigation in Zhao Mili's case. Zhao Jianshu sent someone to kill him. The other guy was also accidentally killed. The girl concluded. And so, he thinks the two have risen from the dead to take possession of the loopholes. After all, who are they? The girl tried her best not to give herself away. She ordered her subordinates to immediately go guard the remaining loopholes. The man walked over to her and embraced her affectionately. No need. They are a gift for their paradise. The perfect complement for the plan of eternal life. The girl looked at him with incomprehension. The man's look changed, so she really didn't know anything. He snapped his finger. A second later, a hologram of the planet Earth appeared. When he was young, he noticed that the planet existed because of energy, and that energy was beginning to age. So, in order for everyone to live a long life, he developed an energy value system. The energy from people's mood swings supplies the entire planet. It was like a big blob inside her that looked like a heart. But people's emotions, an unstable thing, and it was harder and harder to influence them. Therefore, he trained the four of them separately from each other, with the dark side that does not see the light symbols of the entertainment industry, power and might, to which represented to stimulate the people, energy values. But in recent years, stimulation has become more and more futile. The man sighed heavily, asked, but why not distribute power and give it to the people? One would be able to be more motivated. The man sighed again. She's still too young. Most people only have shallow vision and weak minds. Instead, you need a sober reasoning person, and they are just that. The man's face changed to a predatory grin. But with the appearance of 9.874 and this guy, the situation reversed. But they may have found a new generator for their planet. They found a new way. The girl sighed heavily. She replied that she was happy to serve her superiors. But inside, she was crying very loudly with grief. Somebody at least help. This man is a complete egoist. He alone makes the decision instead of the people of this planet. No way. She should quickly tell all of this to the teacher before they are caught. The girl asked, should she arrest and bring them to him? The man put his hand out in front of his face. No need. He'd already done it. But the girl didn't let him finish. She said she'd do it in the best way possible. Suddenly, the doors crunched open with a crunch, and an unknown monster appeared on the threshold. People tried to hold it back, but the monster was much stronger. It was a robot that was covered in armor that energy bullets couldn't penetrate. Anything that hit it was instantly reflected. The energy bullets flew backward, piercing through their opponents. The cops screamed in pain, but immediately died from the sizzle. Nian shook her head. Her plan had almost succeeded. Now they would watch him run away. Even though it was only the first level, it still took a combination of their power. In this battle, they would definitely win. Ping Ping looked away in horror. She didn't understand what kind of monster was this, and how did it get here? But inside, the girl didn't realize what she should do in such a situation. Should she run away? But that didn't seem like something a human would do. Would it be discovered? Or take this chance and help the teacher kill Capita? The girl had already pulled out her gun. She turned to her supervisor. His safety comes first, and they should back off first, right? Suddenly, something began to change in the man. His body was covered with a layer of digital energy. The girl shifted her surprised gaze to him. The man asked, where did her cold-bloodedness go? Did she think some bug could scare the lion? The man was approaching the robot, who had already swung his metal arm to swat him. But it wasn't that simple. The man had activated the barrier. A second later, the mechanical brat was encased in an energy cage. Now it was impossible to break out of it. Squinting into his eyes, the man coldly ordered the brat to be destroyed. A second later, the steel giant split into several pieces. It was as if an unknown wave had ripped it apart. The power was so strong that the robot didn't even have time to move a finger. Everyone was in deep shock. What is this? Who was the monster after all? The girls were in shock. They watched with frightened eyes as the leader dealt such a huge beast with a single blow. Capita stood, and the wreckage of the robot he had destroyed fell beside him. Everyone must have long forgotten that only one man rules this world. He stood and looked down at everyone now. There was no doubt how strong he was, and now they would see his true power. But the man quickly calmed down and sighed heavily. Turning to the girl, he said, Kurz will bring those two here, but before those two appear, we need to clear the neighborhood. Girl, has he recovered yet? When did this happen? She didn't believe it. What does he mean by clearing the neighborhood? The man turned the other way and began to speak. She didn't think that the foreigners in this world were just the two of them, did she? Although they are only bugs, but if they jump in front of you all the time, it would be annoying. The girl shifted her gaze to the two who were sitting tied up. This is terrible. He's going to examine all the data for deviation. At this rate, she won't be able to pass. Even this body will be revealed. At that moment, the girl realized that she couldn't help him and wished him luck. At this time, the friends were leaving the circus, where the hypnotized people were still wandering around. Lee asked, won't anything be taken off the others? The girl smiled and said that it was a special combat power. Lee looked at her with a surprised look and asked, they wouldn't do like that bastard, would they? Wu Ji told him not to be naive. After seizing over the control of energy, he should have realized that the competition was the amount of energy. Does he think Capita only possesses energy that he shows to the public? If they don't, they're the only ones who lose in the end. But suddenly, the man did something no one expected him to do. He snatched the eye out of the protagonist's hands. The girl just looked at him in surprise. The man was boiling with rage right before his eyes. His body began to be covered in energy once again, and he adopted a fighting stance. The rules of a good guy is that you can't use people. The main characters began to object. These are people who have already been controlled, and what principles is he talking about? Let him give him the eye immediately. The spirits anticipated the battle and incited their masters to fight. That way he and you will finish the mission, keep their friendship, and there will be winnings left over. Just let them discuss together then. But why not give him the loophole in the beginning, right? The girl looked at him and tried to persuade him. Suddenly, a car came out of nowhere carrying two big guys. There was another man sitting in the car, looking down at them. Who the hell is that? He looked ugly, but it was a beautiful idea. The man didn't wait for an answer and said, I guess they didn't reach a consensus. That's too bad. Is this the delivery of another loophole? In that case, then their reconciliation would depend on his help. Suddenly the car began to be covered with energy, and the people who were carrying it changed their appearance beyond recognition. A picture appeared, where the protagonist looked straight into the eyes of his student. Don't let all the troubles go. Group number 57, 54, 46, 59, 9 looking for a wave of attention. Someone created a funny picture of a teacher holding the principal. Now he was looking at him with an angry look and shouting, "Let's see who didn't like it." The principal still looked just as pathetic. This meme should have gotten the audience laughing. It completely repeated the situation from real life.